From the heartland of America and the gateway to the West, good morning, good evening, wherever you may be across the nation, around the world. I'm George Norrie. Welcome to Coast AM. Later on tonight, a 3,000-year-old mystery that could affect all of us. And before we get going into our program tonight, I would hope that all of you would take just a brief moment of silence, a bit of a prayer for the nearly 3,000 people who died on 9/11/2001. A tragedy will never be forgotten, and it changed us, probably forever. In a moment, Dr. Judy Wood will join us with her thoughts, her theory on what happened on that day. Regardless of your belief system in what took down those buildings and how those planes crashed into the buildings, remember this: nearly 3,000 people died tragically, jumping from buildings, dying in the rubble. Firemen, policemen, responders, people working in the office buildings. Show them at least how much you care about their life. And just take a brief moment, a brief prayer for that, if you would do that. Here's what's happening. A solar flare, a strong one, is blasting its way through Earth, but the worst of its power looks like it will barely skim above the planet and not cause many problems. It's been several years since Earth has had a solar storm of this size coming from sunspots smack in the middle of the sun, according to the director of the Space Weather Prediction Center in Boulder, Colorado. New calculations from satellite data show that the worst of the energetic particles streaming from the sun likely will go north or above Earth this time. Our astronomer, Dr. Stephen Cates, Dr. Sky, with us. Well, looks like we may have dodged another one, Stephen. As you know, we want this grid, our power grid, insulated.
Absolutely, George, and we're kind of lucky this time as you're reporting to the world. This particular solar flare that took off the sun as a coronal mass ejection on September the 10th, on the scale of X flares, George, which is still the most powerful, this one registers kind of like a seismic event you would have on the Richter scale, on the low end of the X scale, at 1.6. So what does that mean to everybody listening? As you mentioned before, and accurately, the blow may be just above the Earth itself, but sky watchers have the real good potential, and this is an interesting prediction here. A lot of astronomers agree with this. Between now, as we're on the radio here on Coast, and maybe around 5 a.m. Pacific time, all through that window, if sky watchers in northern latitudes, of course, go outside, they see auroras a lot. But this whole window of auroras may move down, maybe even to the northern states of the United States. Some are saying that this could slightly affect GPS and what have you. But, George, you're so right. We have to prepare for the eventuality. We're told that this is going to happen. And solar physicists tell us that still, get a load of this, a 12% chance of the big one happening that you and I talk about between 2012 and 2022, George. And so the basic part of this whole thing is people go out looking in the sky, you can see the beauty of the auroras. And quickly, George, a little thing about our Sunday night report of that purported meteor that might have hit Nicaragua. So far, the meteorite might be a meteor wrong, as nobody seems to indicate any debris that may have come from a meteor or a meteorite at this point. So that's something interesting, and we'll continue to update you, as we do on our websites, drsky.com. And, George, our photo group is heading to the Reno air races, and we'll have great updates from one of the greatest American air shows, the Reno air races, at photorecon.net.
You got it, Stephen. Thanks for those updates. In South Dakota, an early September winter storm in the Black Hills has dumped up to 8 inches of snow in the area, while Rapid City received its earliest snowfall in more than 120 years. The snowfall in downtown Rapid City is the earliest the city has seen since 1888. As we've been reporting, in July and early August, doctors at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta diagnosed 15 to 20 children a week with serious respiratory infections, a normal number for the summer months. Then pediatricians started to see more children who are having trouble breathing, more parents with worried looks on their faces. And since school started, the hospital has seen an average of 100 cases a week. Now more than 10 states around the Midwest and Southeast now have reported seeing similarly high numbers of hospitalizations for children with severe respiratory illness. The virus has sent more than 30 children a day to a Kansas City, Missouri hospital where about 15% of the youngsters were placed in intensive care. Richard Kyle, the actor best known for playing the James Bond villain Jaws, died Wednesday at a Fresno, California hospital. The cause of death for the 74-year-old actor, not released yet. The 7'2" Kyle was born in Detroit in 1939, won over audiences worldwide in the 1970s as the steel-toothed character Jaws in the Roger Moore Bond classics The Spy Who Loved Me and Moonraker. My producer, Tom Danheiser, tells me that Clyde Lewis, one of our colleagues who does his own syndicated program in many markets right before our program, may have been hospitalized again. We're going to check into that story. He was just released after he had 5 pulmonary embolisms. 1 is serious. 5 is really bad. But Clyde was able to get out of the hospital on that. Say a prayer for Clyde. We're going to check into this story and see exactly what is going on in that particular case. And if we have some more information before I'm off the air tonight, we'll pass it on to you. 10 Arab states, including Saudi Arabia, have agreed to rally with the U.S. in tackling the threat posed by the Islamic State jihadist ISIS. The agreement followed talks between Arab ministers and Secretary of State John Kerry in the Saudi city of Jeddah. Let's check in with the man who's been with us all along on this story, WorldNet Daily's Jerry Corsi. Jerry, any updates for us on ISIS?
Well, I think the critical thing today was that even though Secretary of State John Kerry was in Saudi Arabia and trying to get a coalition put together, you had Turkey, Jordan, and Egypt all say they really don't want to participate. And this is critical because Turkey and Egypt probably have the largest army and would be the most capable of helping us if the United States is not going to put any ground troops in Iraq to combat ISIS. And it's understandable why. I mean, you've got both Turkey and Jordan who are very geographically close to Iraq, and then Egypt, which of course is, close to, in the whole region, bordering Israel and closest to Syria. Jordan and Turkey both border Syria as well. I mean, these are Sunni states, and they do not want to fight ISIS, which is a Sunni kind of renegade army. And this is one of the dynamics. The United States' natural enemies in fighting the ISIS Sunnis would be the Shiites, both Assad in Syria and Iran, but both Assad and Iran have been enemies of the United States, and it's very difficult for us now to reach over to the Shiites to try to beat back the Sunni radical insurgents in Iraq. It's very complicated, but the real fundamental dynamic here is Sunni versus Shiite.
Why don't we pull out the weaponry, Jerry, and, I hate to say this, but pull out our nukes, our small tactical nukes, and do one. And just say to the world, and you say to ISIS, leave us alone.
It's tempting, George, but the problem is ISIS has achieved a foothold now, both in western Syria, controlling much of the territory in the cities, and also through eastern Iraq and northeastern Iraq. And as any of the U.S. military who have been in Iraq or Afghanistan fighting will tell you, it took us almost street-by-street fighting with ground troops coordinated with air and a high degree of intelligence in order to beat back and win Iraq to begin with, after we ousted Saddam Hussein. So that kind of fighting is what's going to be required. I mean, it's hard. There's dozens of small cities in the western part of Syria and the eastern part of Iraq that are now controlled by ISIS, and very much like Hezbollah in Lebanon, these ISIS fighters blend into the citizenry. They're not just out there as an army, and you'd basically have to be destroying huge areas in order to destroy ISIS, including millions of civilians.
Well, that is true. Jerry, thanks so much. We'll continue to look for your updates. An Ohio man fell 60 feet off a cliff while sleepwalking in a national forest in Kentucky. Lucky suffered only minor injuries. 27 years old. He was camping with his friends in the Daniel Boone National Forest when he plummeted down a steep incline a few yards into his nighttime stroll. Jeez, you got to watch out for that. Well, in a moment, Dr. Judy Wood joins us. Her book, Where Did the Towers Go?, will be talking about her thoughts on 9/11. Hard to believe, folks, it's been 13 years since that tragic day. 13 years. Where does the time go? But look how this planet has changed. Up next, Dr. Judy Wood on Coast to Coast AM. Welcome back to Coast to Coast. I'm George Norrie. As I was mentioning, 13 years ago, of course, we saw and witnessed perhaps one of our most tragic events in our lifetime. Maybe the most tragic event we will ever see, but maybe not. Dr. Judy Wood, former professor of mechanical engineering, she has research expertise in experimental stress analysis, structural mechanics, materials characterization, and materials engineering science. Now, in the time since 9/11, she has applied her expertise to a forensic study of more than 40,000 images, hundreds of video clips, and a large volume of witness testimony pertaining to the destruction of the World Trade Center complex. Her work, Where Did the Towers Go? Judy was on with me about 3 years ago, and here she is back on Coast to Coast on this ominous day. Judy, it's a pleasure to have you back.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
In the 3 years or so that we last had you on, have you seen any new evidence, or has anything changed to either continue to back up your theory or to change your mind?
It's not a theory. I deal with evidence. And as I say, if you don't have enough evidence to solve a problem, you can't solve it. You don't have enough evidence. And you don't replace what you don't have with guesses and theories and speculation, because then you're solving an imaginary problem, not the real problem. And you can't solve the real problem if you don't have enough evidence. And so you can, but what evidence you do have, you can go within that. And that's what I've done. And after you collect the evidence and evaluate the evidence to determine what happened, then you go to defining what the destructive mechanism was. And in doing that, you can eliminate the impossible and then retain what's left. It's like you start out with this big circle around everything, and then you can toss stuff out of the circle that is impossible.
Judy, in your work, Where Did the Towers Go? Evidence of directed free energy technology on 9/11. I want you to, for those who, one, didn't hear you with me 3 years ago and are brand new to the program, tell us about this and about your work, and then we'll get into the interview.
Okay. What I did is look at all of the evidence, and starting at the beginning, the issue of how fast the building went away. I don't say collapse. It didn't collapse. It went away. It turned to dust, and
pulverized, basically.
And also, it didn't burn up. It didn't slam to the ground, but most of it turned into dust in midair. I know that sounds strange, but you look at the evidence, and that's what you see. All of Manhattan was covered in ankle-deep dust, and went down the eastern seaboard, went up and away. How do we know that it didn't slam to the ground? Well, the seismic chart doesn't reflect that. There's no S or P wave. Those are the seismic signals that travel through the Earth.
And they should have registered something. Okay.
Yeah, it's like hitting a rock with a hammer. It's like hitting a tuning fork. It should ring. Didn't. There's no detectable S or P waves for any of the 5 events. The North Tower got a hold, South Tower got a hold, South Tower went away, North Tower went away, then Building 7 went away. For all those 5 events, there's no S or P waves, but in regular controlled demolitions, you get S waves and P waves and surface waves. Not only that, they calculate the seismic signal, the equivalent Richter scale reading, based on the surface wave. And even the surface waves were so weak that it was equal or less than when they blew up the Seattle King Dome. That was a 2.3 on the Richter scale. The North Tower was a 2.3 and the South Tower was a 2.1. And it should have been a lot more than that. It was equivalent to the bottom 18 or 20 stories of building.
And there wasn't any, and Judy, there wasn't any concrete mass concrete from all those levels. It should have been all over the place. Concrete should have been in huge heaps. It was all dust, as you said.
Or not just the concrete, but everything. You know, file cabinets, chairs, desks, toilets. Toilets are easy to see, like at a junkyard, remnants of toilets. You know, shiny porcelain surfaces. There wasn't even one recognizable part of one. And there should have been over 3,000.
And I want to point out, by the way, every time we do programs on this, we do get some emails from some people who feel somewhat offended. They feel as if, we're not being patriotic because we're questioning the official version. I want to say this right now. It is healthy to be skeptic. It is healthy to investigate. And I think you really never can take the official version, which is, could be the John F. Kennedy assassination with the Warren report, or this report of the 9/11 Commission. You just can't take it at face value. You have to investigate. And Judy, what was it that you saw that got you to start looking at it and coming up with the conclusions that you came up with?
Well, on that day, we were told this is a collapse. And I grew up without a TV set, and I'm not used to listening to a TV. And if the TV is telling me something that conflicts with what I'm seeing, I just shut off my ears. And what I saw was a building turning into dust in midair, sort of like a bubbler drinking fountain. And it wasn't a building collapsing. And this is bizarre, but the grown-ups will take care of it. They'll look into it. I have my job to do. It was, that mentality. But it came clear over the next year or two that nobody was looking into it. The grown-ups weren't going to fix it. Whose job was it to look into it? Not only that, I was thinking very much of the people who died there, and especially the people hanging outside the building from the 105th floor.
Oh, my God, yeah.
I felt like we owe it to them to find out what happened. And I sort of made them a promise that I would find out what happened and tell their story.
Judy, I had Richard Gage on several days ago. Richard Gage, of course, from the 2000 Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. He doesn't agree with your conclusions. And I find this important and fascinating. Both of you, of course, don't agree with the official version of what happened that day. But he doesn't believe that a free energy device or technology took those buildings. So react to that.
Yeah, I don't start with the answer and work backwards. I start with the evidence and then looking at the destructive mechanism. The towers didn't burn up and they didn't slam to the ground, but mostly turned into dust in midair. We know that because the seismic signal was inappropriate for buildings slamming to the ground. Also, the towers were built in this bathtub. It's kind of like a dike that kept out the Hudson River because they were built on bedrock 70, that's 7 times 10, 70 feet below the water table. And if you had 2 500,000-ton buildings slamming to the ground, you would have ruptured the bathtub. Didn't happen. Also, if they slammed to the ground, you see a pile of stuff left over. And actually, when I first started publicly talking about this, I was heavily ridiculed and laughed at. She says that the buildings turned to dust. Isn't that funny? No, all the rubble's there. None of it turned into dust in midair. But that's changing because I've been driving this for quite a while. So if you look at that, already we can tell that, let's look at types of energy, kinetic energy. That's like a wrecking ball, a missile, a bomb that blows stuff apart. Those would have a seismic signal. They'd also launch chunks at a very fast rate that would slam into adjacent buildings. None of the adjacent buildings looked machine gun fired. Also, the debris would have to go somewhere if you blew up the building. The ground shook with a surface wave for 8 seconds, but it would take 9.5 seconds to drop a bowling ball off the roof to the ground. That's another piece of evidence that says that building didn't slam to the ground. So kinetic energy can be eliminated as a destructive mechanism. We're not talking about the device. We're talking about the mechanism of destruction. You have to first look at the mechanism, the failure mode, so to speak. And let's look at thermal energy, where the buildings cook to death. If they're cooked to death, well, you would have seen some, bright, blinding light if it was high heat. You wouldn't see unburned paper flying all over the place.
No, you would not.
when the dust cloud rolled down the streets, people were trying to outrun it, but they couldn't, and then it just mowed over them and kept on going. It just left them covered with dust. They may have had trouble breathing, but they weren't cooked.
Judy, when we come back, I want you to explain how a directed free energy device or technology works and where they may have been situated if those buildings came down that way. I'm George Norrie, back in a moment on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast. George Norrie with you, and of course Dr. Judy Wood, as we talk about her conclusions about the towers and 9/11. Judy, explain how this directed free energy technology works, if you would, where the devices would have to be. Just put it in perspective for us.
Well, again, as I was saying, you first must determine what happened, and then you look at all the evidence, and then you determine what the destructive mechanism was. And you can't solve the problem unless you have enough evidence. So jumping to the answer and coming up with a theory and speculation and so forth is solving an imaginary problem. You have to be very disciplined. I know it's tough. And the average person, especially in our current educational system, is not geared to doing that. They're geared to jumping to the answer of a multiple choice test. What happens if the correct answer is not one of the choices? So if you start with this very methodical way of going about it, you can determine as much as you can determine according to the evidence. And what the evidence shows is that you can eliminate kinetic energy as the destructive mechanism. I'm not talking about Acme model XXX from aisle 17 of the Acme weapons store. I'm talking about the destructive mechanism. Kinetic energy means that would be in the buildings were beaten to death, like a gravity collapse, a wrecking ball, or missile, or bomb. Thermal energy would mean the buildings were cooked to death. Lots of heat. Those two things, the evidence rules out. But directed energy, as I define it, is energy is instructed to do something differently than it normally does. Instead of the bonding forces of matter being attracted to each other, they're directed to repel each other. It's not like something physically hitting it or cooking it. And so within that, it's a big umbrella of things. But energy is directed somehow to do something differently than it normally does. A lot of people are uncomfortable with that. They want to have a device, an Acme model, whatever.
Yes, and that's how we think. I mean, to me,
right.
Somebody's in another building up on top of the roof, aiming this huge pulse machine at all the World Trade Center buildings and firing away. You're saying, hey, didn't happen like that.
Well, we don't have enough evidence to say that's what happened. But from what the evidence shows, we can define that, and then we can look at parallel evidence that produces the same thing.
Well, let me ask you this, though, Judy, because I want to get a better understanding for this. What you're saying that some kind of directed technology took down the buildings, correct?
And energy was directed in some way.
Now, could it have been within the building?
Sure, it could have been anywhere. Wait, I'm going to be careful because, the detractors will say, she said it was within the building. Yeah,
No, we're just looking at possibilities. Could it have been from a satellite?
It could have been from a variety of places, but here's an example to maybe help you let go of needing to know exactly where it is. Do you have a cell phone?
Mm-hmm.
Do you know where the tower is that your cell phone connects to?
I have no idea.
Bingo! You just know that it works.
I know that it works.
And you're within the range.
That's right.
And your cell phone works, and you're within the range of the tower it connects to. You need those two things to make your phone work. And it might be a similar type thing where it's an interference like that of different energies, where you need different components. But for now, it's, nothing touch. Well, here's one of the pieces of evidence. You have a steel beam flying through the air, and it's dissolving as it flies through the air. It's turning into dust, and it's not hitting anything. That's
amazing. That is amazing. I mean, just like it's like a Star Trek thing. It's just poof, it's gone.
Or it's sort of like an Alka-Seltzer tablet effervescing.
Yeah.
And as I say, if people have trouble understanding that, I ask them to look at the picture, and I say, okay, let's say you're going to impersonate that beam.
Could we say, Judy, that it like dissolves away, but at a very rapid clip?
It's sort of, so follow along with me here. If you're going to impersonate this beam, and you're going to, so you're going to cover yourself with dust and jump off the top of the building, somebody on the ground isn't going to see that amount of dust coming off of you. Okay, so you grab a couple of bags of flour and start heaving that out on the way down. That still isn't going to account for the amount of dust you see coming out of these steel beams. And pretty soon you realize those steel beams have to be turning into dust in order to do what's getting done. And there's also video of a steel beam falling with the dust, looks like it overtakes it, and that doesn't happen. It's just run out of dust. It's run out of solid. It's really turned to dust. And you look at the intersection where it was supposed to land, and there aren't any solid chunks of steel down there.
How big, how much energy would you need if you're going to take down these buildings?
A lot of people like to ask that question. What are the calculations? Well, what are the calculations going to show that the building's there or that it's gone? Just look. Whatever was needed, there was enough. And in order to make calculations, you have to make assumptions. And remember, when you're making assumptions, you're now solving an imaginary problem, not a real problem. Mm-hmm. So that's why with this unusual problem, the discipline of just staying with what you know that you know, and knowing that is something separate from what you don't know, and not mixing the two or filling it in with speculation and hypotheses and theories and guesswork. But we can establish what we do know, that kinetic energy, the building wasn't beaten to death. Thermal energy, rule that out, wasn't cooked to death. And one of the easiest examples or piece of evidence of that is the people at the bottom of stairwell B in Tower 1. The cover image on my book that looks like, I call it the bubbler.
Yeah.
In the Midwest they call drinking fountains, that are constantly going, a bubbler. And that's what that looks like. And would you believe, when that picture was taken, there were people in stairwell B, right at the base of that. And they weren't squashed, they weren't beaten to death, they weren't cooked to death. And they thought they were buried under a huge pile of building, and they thought there's no way they're going to get out by the time they could excavate to them. They thought they had 106 stories on top of them. But it turns out that the dust had gone up and blocked out 100% of the sunlight. That's why it was dark. But when the dust cleared, they looked up and saw blue sky.
Now, tell me this, though, Judy. Tell me this. If this is all correct, and some kind of directed energy took these all down, how long do you think they would have needed to have been either pulsing at the building or however
Wait. You're making assumptions. Again, that's dangerous, because then you're off solving an imaginary problem. If you stick with what you know that you know that you know, this is
all right. Well, what do we know?
What we do know is that the buildings weren't cooked to death and they weren't beaten to death. So that means the destructive mechanism was not kinetic energy or thermal energy. So bombs blowing up are ruled out.
They found thermite, right? Did they not?
No, they didn't find thermite. They found aluminum powder and iron oxide. Those are some of the ingredients used to make thermite. And, the peer-reviewed paper, they call it peer-reviewed, that was pay for publishing, saying I don't disagree with it, that aluminum powder and iron oxide were found. But guess what? You know what the building was made out of?
What?
It was a steel frame building with aluminum cladding.
Jeez, all right.
So if it's turned to dust, what are you going to find in the dust? But, okay, so if let's say they're going to claim that was thermite. What's the destructive mechanism? What in that dust baggie connects to what happened to the buildings? If you can't make that connection, you don't go anywhere. And the part in my book that I talked about, I used, instead of thermite, I used chocolate chip cookies. So the buildings were turned to dust. Therefore, the dust would be expected to contain traces of all materials that were in the buildings. Finding traces of chocolate, sugar, and nano-wheat flour in the dust would not prove that chocolate chip cookies turned the buildings to dust. It would not prove that these ingredients had been combined as chocolate chip cookies in the buildings, nor would it prove that such cookies were capable of turning building to dust. The same is true for thermite.
Now, there are some people, Judy, who say that planes didn't even hit those buildings. I find that preposterous.
Well, the building mostly turned to dust. Can airplanes turn buildings to dust?
No, but people saw planes hit the buildings.
But did that turn the building to powder in midair?
No, I'm not saying the planes alone may have done it, but I'm saying the planes did hit.
I'm looking at the destructive mechanism. You know, some people say there's fake planes, and some people say there's real planes. Well, fake planes can't turn a building to dust, and neither can real planes. So getting people arguing about planes and no planes or whatever is a distraction away from what happened to the building. And so I'm very focused on what happened to the building. So I don't deal with the planes.
All right, so that's not your area of expertise, basically.
Well, it's you know, I don't also pay attention to what the operator of the technology had for breakfast. It doesn't solve what happened to the buildings. You know, that's a different issue.
There was always talk that Building 7, which apparently wasn't hit by almost with nothing, basically, was pulled. What are we talking about there? Same thing happened?
Yep, same thing. And did you know it wasn't 3 buildings that were destroyed that day? It wasn't 4 buildings that were destroyed that day. It wasn't 5 buildings. It wasn't 6 buildings. It was 7 buildings that were destroyed that day. Building 4 is one that I've become fascinated with at times, where the entire main body of the building went missing. Gone. You know, gone with the wind into powder. I'm not saying, you know, disappeared or vaporized. I'm saying it's not there. You got a lot of powder around. You know, there's some scraps of stuff, but there's also images right below the ground of where that was. It was punched down a little bit into the first layer below ground, but in the parking garage, a few stories below that, you can't even tell anything happened. The lights are still on. There's maybe dustier than usual. But where'd the building go? Building 4. That was kind of a large. It was a 9-story building, but widthwise it was, you know, bigger footprint. But it's gone. Building 3, gone except for a little shoebox at one end. Building 6, you know, someone today wrote me and said it was saying it was like a jack-o'-lantern all carved out in the middle. Building 5 had these cylindrical holes in it. There's, you know, Building 7, it had all this stuff pouring out of it all afternoon for about 7 hours. A lot of material. And then when it went away, it made a 0.6 on the Richter scale. That's like a jackhammer.
Well, it sure is. How much energy, Judy, do you think was needed to destroy these buildings?
It could even be negative energy. If you can understand the mechanism, that's what the beauty of this is. If there's a silver lining in this, it's that this technology was used for destructive purposes, but it doesn't have to be. It could be used for good purposes, for providing free energy to the world. If you have the ability to affect, you know, the nature of matter, instead of having atoms attract each other, they're repelling each other. So if you just give it that instruction, it isn't like you have to put in a whole lot of bombs and a lot of energy that way. It could be the energy comes from the material. And actually, the dust cloud that rolled down the street, first responders that I talked to said it was cooler than ambient temperature. Not only was it not hot, it was cooler. And then it started feeling warm because, you know, when you put acid on your hands, it feels like it's burning up, but it could be room temperature. There was something in the dust that was eating on their skin. And they just couldn't, like, they're scrubbing off in the shower afterwards, just couldn't get it out. It was interesting.
So what would happen, Judy, I don't want to get morbid here, but if a human being is in that building and gets hit with this directed energy, what happens to the human? Is the human pulverized too?
I want to get away from the idea of, you know, a point and shoot laser beam. It's more of a field effect, like the coverage range of your cell phone. You know, it's a zone of effect. But remember the people who left the building early, they've been referred to as jumpers. I don't think they voluntarily jumped. But they somehow found themselves, getting away from something and they ended up out the window. And weird other things were happening in the building. Like one woman called her husband and said, "Oh, we're going to start down the stairs, and you got wet T-shirt wrapped around the head, and we'll call you on cell phone when we get to the bottom." And 2 or 3 stories later, she went out the window.
Do you ever get, Dr. Wood, into the who?
No, but I got about as close as I got closer than anybody has in the public domain. That is, I pretty much know who knows, and that's who I try to take to court.
And tell me about that.
These were contractors on the NIST report, National Institute of Standards and Technology.
Right.
And they were mandated by Congress to determine why and how the towers collapsed.
Okay.
They didn't do that. And I wrote a request for correction to NIST saying, the contractors were leading them astray, and we can't sue a government agency, but we can sue contractors for fraud of a government agency. And there's a couple of the contractors, and one in particular, that had the most number of people on the contract, on the NIST report. They are developers and manufacturers of energy weapons.
Aha.
Not only that, they also had, and still have, I believe, contract with the U.S. government to know everything about any weapon of mass destruction that exists or is being developed anywhere. So not only do they know what technology it is, but they know whose technology it is. Wouldn't it have been nice to have them under oath?
What happened to the suit?
Let's see, the lower court judge dismissed it, saying he wasn't going to hear a case about who shot JFK or what landed on the moon.
Oh.
Excuse me, sir. Did you read the decision about that? Did you get confused as to which?
Yeah, not that case.
So we appeal it, and there's 3 judges in the Court of Appeals. They were very respectful. But see, while working on the case, I couldn't talk about it and couldn't advertise it. And there was a kind of a clamp down on anybody else talking about it. Not legally, but, those who didn't want this case to go forward were keeping everybody else from knowing about it. But there was only like 5 of us or 6 of us, count them on one hand, who supported this case. Now, if you were those judges, what would you do? And what those judges did, and they're very respectful of me in doing this, they wrote in the written decision, they acknowledged the law applied to this case, but they're ignoring the law and dismissed the case.
Absolutely riveting, Judy. I've got to tell you, as so many people have all their different theories, this one is very frightening.
It's not a theory. It's not a theory. I know what I know that I know.
I know the way you feel about that, but a lot of people believe that. A lot of people do call it a theory, don't they?
Because that's what they're used to doing, is just, what someone says, oh, that's a theory, and is 2 plus 3, equal to 5, is that a theory?
Shouldn't be.
If I want to know your height, I would start with a tape measure, not a theory. What I'm reporting here is basically that, is evidence that anyone can observe if they look in my book. I don't tell people what to think.
Let me ask you this. And we're coming up to the break, so I may have to ask you next hour. But why do you not accept the theory or conclusion of Gage in the
architects? He doesn't present evidence. He presents theories. It is a theory.
Okay, but could you? I asked him. I says, how in the heck could you put explosives in these buildings and nobody see it?
Yeah, you go into work one morning and the wall's missing because somebody's putting something in there and somebody doesn't notice. But not only that, is how do you detonate it? Is one of the parts of my book. I showed, just to remind people, I showed pictures of these signs you see at the side of the road saying, blasting zone ahead, turn off cell phones and 2-way radios. Okay, how do you do that for Manhattan for 6 months?
Yeah, you can't. Judy, stay with us. We're going to come back in a moment. Dr. Judy Wood with us. Her websites are linked up at coasttocoastam.com. I'm George Norrie, and we'll be right back. Well, next hour, of course, we're talking about a 3,000-year-old mystery that could affect all of us. And when we come back in a moment with Dr. Judy Wood, we're going to continue talking about her conclusions about where did the towers go, and we'll take your phone calls this hour as well on Coast to Coast AM. Welcome back, Dr. Judy Wood with us. We're going to take your phone calls as well. Judy, I assume this technology is even better than what it was 13 years ago.
Right, as an assumption. It's okay if you assume that. I'm solving the problem of what happened on 9/11, and looking at the evidence, and that's really, really important to do. But if you look at what happened, it is phenomenal. All sorts of strange things happening. There's also various ways of showing that the building turned out it's all consistent. Like, for example, the building went away in 8 seconds. The ground, only shook for 8 seconds. It takes 9.5 seconds for dropping a bowling ball off the roof to hit the ground. The only way that could happen is if the building didn't slam to the ground. As well as the tipping top of Tower 2, it looks like it stops tipping, and it looks like it violates the laws of conservation of angular momentum. If it was a rigid body, that would be true. But what that does is prove that it doesn't remain a rigid body. Think of, the top part, the tipping part, turning into little specks of dust that can keep rotating in place. So it can it can maintain conservation of angular momentum. Just the whole thing doesn't keep rotating. You see it turn and then it stops twisting. So there's quite a few different aspects of that, as well as the first responder testimony. The building turning to dust, and there's various ones that say, "Hey, this is not smoke. You can breathe." Firefighters know that in smoke, it displaces the oxygen. You can't breathe.
You can't breathe. That's right.
But these guys could breathe. They stick their face in the armpit of their shirt so they can use their shirt as an air filter to block out the dust. But it was oxygen in that air.
I mean, it looked like that day, it looked like volcanic ash falling down on everybody, didn't it?
Right, yeah. And it was just, ankle deep for blocks and blocks. It was a tremendous amount of dust. And it was all very, very fine. You're talking about, the people in the building. Well, the people left the building early, referred to as jumpers. It was estimated that there were, 3 or 4 people per face per minute coming out of Tower 1.
Just jumping out. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's say take the low number. Let's say 3 per face. There's 4 faces. That's 12 people a minute. Times 100 minutes. That's 1,200 people.
Sad.
And add to that the 343 firefighters.
That's right.
And you're up to
and
1,543. Right. And so you basically have about 1,600, and that's all the number of people that have been identified.
Yeah. And then the sad people on the plane, of course.
Right. So basically, the people who left the building early were the ones that they have DNA that's identifiable. In the building, no traces. And the various dust studies, is the particulate that's rising up, it had organic components to it. The stuff was so fine, it was about 1/100th of the size of red blood cells.
That's a good point.
And that's, the size of DNA. And it gets inhaled right into the bloodstream. It may even go across the blood-brain barrier. But that's definitely going to make people sick. But you can't get stuff that fine with a hammer banging against a rock.
No, there's no way. Judy, was this Tesla technology?
I don't know what this was, but I can look at parallel evidence that reproduces the very same things, as well as, natural occurring things like tornadoes. Tornadoes produce very similar things, including, what appears to be lightning or, almost fire, up the middle. But, of course, I can't, at least I don't know how to go back in time to visit Nikola Tesla. But,
all right. Let's take some
somebody
calls
that lives in the here and now that can reproduce it was John Hutchison, and I went to watch him reproduce it.
The Hutchison effect.
Yes, and it's got all the same characteristics.
You're right about that. Let's go to Ron in Tampa, Florida. Ron, welcome to the program. Thanks for calling. Go ahead.
Hi. Thanks for doing this subject. I know we're being lied to about 9/11, but the problem I see with Dr. Wood's theory is there had to be explosions in all three buildings. You hear so many accounts from the firefighters, but janitor in the North Tower said he heard an explosion in the basement before the plane hit the building. You see what looks like cannons shooting out the sides of the building, dust and the steel beams flying out. And if you look at the top of Building 7, right when it's first starting to collapse, you'll see the two sides of the top of the building going down in a V-shaped formation. The top starts to collapse in the middle. The whole Building 7 just splits down the middle, like taking a knife coming right down through it. That's a controlled demolition. They run explosions up through the middle of the building, and the building just falls in on itself.
I appreciate your belief in that because it appears that way from just a glance. And let's look at a different scenario. People go to a magic show and they see a magician pull a rabbit out of a cufflink of his shirt. Does that mean he did just because it looked like it? Or, David Copperfield disappeared a freight train and disappeared the Statue of Liberty. Because something appears a certain way, you need more evidence to that. You couldn't take somebody to court based on it looks like. You need more evidence. If it was a controlled demolition, it was slammed to the ground, you'd have seismic signals. If it slammed to the ground, you see a pile of stuff. If it slammed to the ground, you'd rupture the bathtub. None of those things happened.
Judy, what has your conclusions done to your career, to yourself, your book? Where did the towers go? I mean, have you been under fire? Have you been accepted? What has happened?
I've had many engineers who have written to me who wouldn't want to come out and get shot at themselves, but they are so glad that I'm standing forth, and they say, just know that we're behind you. I also get various, threats and insults and name-calling, and I realize that's the best that those people can do. But as for, the sound of explosions, I covered that in my book. Here's a pretty interesting one. One says, his boss asked him, it says, we're walking down, I realized we only have two people. I saw my vehicle, the seats were covered. I still have my bag. I hold it like a trophy, like people collect basketballs. I haven't touched whatever the force was. It was so strong it went inside the bag. That sounds interesting. And said, but we were there. Vehicle 219 was destroyed. And his boss says, was it on fire? And he answers, what? Boss, was it on fire? And he answers, fire? We saw the sucker blow up. We heard a boom.
Yeah.
And this is his emergency medical vehicle, just spontaneous combustion. And here's another one. I'll just jump to a particular part. It says this huge ambulance must have had Scott bottles or oxygen bottles on it. These were going off. You hear a boom, and they're all exploding. Another one says the Scott cylinders and oxygen cylinders were all letting go. You'd hear them all blowing up left and right. This is at street level. The Scott bottles, those are the air tanks that the firefighters wear so they can breathe clean air when they're in oxygen, when they're in a smoky environment. Why were those exploding at street level? Why were vehicles, appearing to go into spontaneous combustion? Did they put thermite in the Scott packs? I don't think so. So there was a sound of explosions. Things do go boom. Put an egg in your microwave. It'll go boom.
It sure will. Now, Judy, is this something you worked on by yourself, or did you have assistance with other engineers?
I pretty much worked on it by myself, but I've had other engineers who have read through it when I finished it, and other ones, and also Professor Eric Larson, who also read through it and helped me with some wording of some things. And helped me make it more smooth for reading. And there are other people who were just invaluable in helping with this. Thanks for bringing that up. Russ Gerst, Andrew Johnson, Jerry Leaphart, my lawyer. These people, Frank Ferguson, these people have been just so helpful that I couldn't have done it without him, including Morgan Reynolds. I'll put him at the top of the list because I wouldn't have gotten anywhere if he hadn't helped me get going.
All right.
But so there's a handful of people who, were just vital to, if nothing else, running defense.
Back to some more calls for you. David's in New York, first-time caller. David, go ahead. You're on the program with us.
Yeah, hi. I was just wanted to comment on the free energy for a moment.
Sure.
I'm a photographer as a hobby, and at night I've been taking some sky pictures, and I realized that I've actually caught on video what is basically a spherical shape where it looks like there's waves of energy rolling around it. And then just as a coincidence, I was packing up my gear, leaving in the morning, just after sunrise, and right from the same spot, I don't know if it was the same thing or not, but right from the same spot, what looks like a plane starts to fly across the sky within 30 seconds, it went from horizon to horizon. I don't know if the two were related or not, but and when you say that you saw out of the building things coming out of the windows for hours afterwards, I assumed that you were talking about the free energy that was.
No, I was talking about the people who left the building early. That while the building was standing, there were people who went out of the building
Before whatever
before
was
the
turned
building
on.
went away. After the building went away, there's the stuff is still breaking down and fuming from the ground up. But keep being observant. That's very good. Just keep observing things. See what's there, not what you think you're supposed to see is there, but just observe what is actually there. And
whatever was used, Judy, whatever was used, I assume it was silent, probably no noise, right?
Right. Here's a contrast with the bombs. There were things that exploded. There's also a lot of water tanks in the building. They can't pump the water all the way up the top. They have to pump it up in stages from tank to tank to tank.
Tank to tank. Yeah, you're right.
And what if those tanks start, deteriorating and losing their strength? At some point, they're going to rupture, and they're going to squirt water out. So that's just something that you would expect to see. Let me read another quote from a first responder.
Sure.
This is Michael Ober. He says, "I don't remember the sound of a building hitting the ground. Someone told me it was measured on the Richter scale. I don't know how true that is. If the building's hitting the ground that hard, how do I not remember the sound of it?"
It should be deafening.
Right. It should sound like it was raining dump trucks. And there's, like when Building 7 went away, they're interviewing some woman, and Building 7 was behind her, and the photographer or interviewer, I don't know which, you hear the voice saying, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, whoa," and they see the building going down. You don't hear any bang, bang, bang. You don't hear a crunchity, poppity, bangity, boom.
Well, Judy, that was a day of chaos. So many people were in shock. You had so many responders out there, firemen, policemen, EMTs, running around doing what they're doing. Many of them lost their lives. I guess in that kind of chaos, you don't stop to think if you're hearing something or what.
Well, this is the recordings. Somebody who's this is broadcast on the news. I've seen it.
After the fact.
No, well, then the photographer, the building's like dropping down. It gets halfway down towards the ground. The guy's going, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, whoa!" He doesn't know what else to say. And because the woman who's being interviewed is behind her, so she doesn't see it. She's not at all reacting to it.
Yeah, he's looking at it. And that's a good point. Let's go to Larry, truck driving in Virginia, east of the Rockies. Larry, thank you. You're up with us.
Yeah, thank you, George.
Sure thing, Larry.
Judy?
Hey.
I'd like to thank you for your evidence that you've posted up on your website, but the weapon system you're talking about is very unique. It also produces a very unique evidence, which you got documented. I got a picture of a V-22 Osprey hovering next to the Twin Towers on 9/11. It has an onboard directed energy anti-missile defense system based on the technology of wormholes and curved space, it has the firepower to do all the damage you've seen it do on 9/11. And these same B-22 Ospreys are in action in Iraq right now as I'm speaking. So in the end, you're going to win in this game you play here. You're going to come out on top. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for calling in.
Judy, I assume you don't get involved in the politics of the aftermath of 9/11. What has happened, Homeland Security, Patriot Act. You don't touch that, do you?
Not a whole lot, but what I have also come to notice is, patterns of behavior. Like what, and the nature of humans, the nature of animals, the animal instinct. And there's something important, and I'm so glad you brought this up, that I'd like listeners to realize that it hit me on 9/11. One of the faculty members in my department said, yeah, after the cold bombing, we got to go take them out. We got to take them all out. And mentally, he had in his hand a pitchfork and needed to go after the bad guy. And I realized that when people are in revenge mode, they shut off all logical thinking. That's what animals do. That's how they get dogs to fight to the death. When they're going at it, they just shut off logical thinking, whether it's fear mode or revenge mode. So when it then came to, oh, it's the Bush administration, it's Cheney, it's this, it's that, same thing. Doesn't matter. If you're in revenge mode, you're shutting off logical thinking. So you replace Bin Laden with Bush or with, ISIS, whatever you want. It's bringing up that same kind of response, and you better say, whoa, it's time to pause and reflect. Let's look at the evidence and work carefully and patiently and take care of ourselves first, and then worry about what to do about what happened. But don't be quick to, grab the pitchfork and go after. And I've also noticed that every year around 9/11, 9/11 was an attack on human consciousness. It shut down logical thinking because of that. And then if you give it a booster shot every year at this time, it keeps it going. And so I've noticed that working up to 9/11, you see all this stuff happening. Throw your TV out the window. That's what Richard Hall says, a fellow in England. If you're finding yourself worked up, throw your TV out the window. It's just working up. And it shuts off logical thinking, and that's a very important thing to understand.
We're going to come back in a moment with Dr. Judy Wood. We're going to take final phone calls with her. Her book, of course, Where Did the Towers Go? Her websites are linked up for you at coasttocoastam.com. Very controversial subject, of course, with all the different conclusions that the experts who've been on this program since 13 years ago, and all of them just simply want to try to get to the bottom of this, the truth, what happened on that day. Why did it happen the way it did? So they're all out there trying to get to the truth, and Dr. Judy Wood is one of them. We'll come back with her and you on Coast to Coast AM. And we're with Dr. Judy Wood. You've heard her conclusions, of course, about the towers, 9/11. We'll take your calls in a moment with her as well. Final calls, indeed. Well, Beyond Belief, that's the television program. I'd like you to take a look at it, look at the trailer, go to this website, and peek around, beyondbelief.com, www.beyondbelief.com. George Norrie back with you, Dr. Judy Wood as well. Judy, would you welcome a new 9/11 investigation of which you could bring forth some of your evidence?
Oh, there is already a new 9/11 investigation that has been conducted. Who would be conducting yet another new one?
Well, I'm talking about an official one by Congress.
To get you just make a Xerox of the one that's already there, and that's what you'd have.
You don't trust them, do you?
Well, who's going to do a new investigation? Engineers and architects? Okay, if engineers do such investigations, why don't you ask Richard Gage why he's calling for a new investigation instead of doing one? Are they not capable of doing one? There has been one that has been conducted, and no one has refuted it. I would like to see someone, find an error in my book and state what that error is and which page it is.
I mean, you're open to debate, aren't you?
Yeah, you don't find the truth through debate. You find it through looking at evidence. There's no, truth doesn't have sides, and the truth is unifying. And so if people are interested in determining what happened, well, they shouldn't be trying to push a political campaign of an idea or a theory or emotions. It's about evidence. And what I've been talking about tonight is, just how you start. We didn't get off ground zero, no pun intended, but let's look at the destructive mechanism. Is it kinetic energy? Is it thermal energy? Or is it directed energy? As I define directed energy, being energy is directed somehow to do something differently than it normally does.
Could it be all of the above?
Nope. As we already talked about earlier tonight, is that the evidence rules out kinetic energy. The buildings were not beaten to death. The evidence rules out thermal energy. The buildings were not cooked to death. So that means any device falling underneath those categories is ruled out. It's impossible to have been used to produce what got done.
Do you have any?
How could you have bombs blowing up without shaking the ground anywhere? It just doesn't work. And there's people who also claim that nukes happened. Remember when the Chernobyl plant blew up? You could measure the fallout all around the globe.
Oh my God! Yeah.
And so you couldn't have kept that a secret. People all over the globe would have.
And I'm sure it still reads. If you took a radiation detector out there.
Right. And when people do weapons testing, other countries can sense it. They have sensors that sense the seismic effects as well as other things. This is like the buildings just turned to dust in place. It affected the Earth's magnetic field at the same time. Also, there's other things. There's a whole long list of evidence that doesn't get discussed. The toasted cars, the cars that appeared to go into spontaneous combustion. I say toast as in their history. They're toast. Cars in this parking lot, a block or two away from the towers, just lit up. And you have all sorts of first responders running down the street, because total blackout because the dust went up and blocked out the sun. They couldn't see where they're going, and they said, thank goodness the cars started lighting up because then I could see where I was going. And one EMT had her turnout coat light up, and she became a human flashlight. Weird things like that going on that are not explained by bombs and 19th century technology. There's something else going on. There's a lot of first responders that talk about experiencing what they thought was like a tornado. And there's one EMT, this is a really interesting one, that dove under an emergency medical vehicle, and he thought he was a goner. He thought he was buried. But when the dust cleared, he looked up and saw blue sky. The vehicle was gone. He didn't remember it rolling off of him, or it was just gone. There was strange things like that happened. There were people exploding. Why did so many people come out of the building? Firefighters had never seen anything like that before. And this one guy said, 20 years of being on the force, he'd only seen one person jump, and that's from the second floor into a net. It was, it was like raining people, is what they said. So you start out and you look at what you know. And if somebody's really interested in the truth, they would be interested in, if somebody can't handle what I'm saying here, then they don't want a new investigation. A scientific investigation. I have over 30 years of experience doing forensic engineering and science. That's my area of expertise. It's like saying, okay, we don't need to have somebody with a medical background. Here, do this heart transplant. No, it's not going to work. This is what I've trained to do my whole life.
You sure have. Let's take some final calls.
I'm very disciplined at looking at just the evidence of what happened. You can't argue about that. It's evidence. Are the buildings still there, or are they gone? That's not a theory. I've been there. I've been there beforehand when they were there, been there afterwards when they're gone. So that's a fact that they're gone. And various other things that are, determine what you know that you know that you know. Let the evidence lead to the conclusions, and not let the conclusions color the evidence.
Peter is truck driving in California. Go ahead, Peter, west of the Rockies.
Oh, right.
Go ahead, Pete.
I don't even know where to start now. I was going to ask her if the buildings were pulverized that bad, why did it take 2 years to haul it off one dump truck at a time?
Except the bathtub was cleaned out by May. It was actually it was cleaned out faster than they thought it would be, but they would also truck in dirt, dump it down, sort around, take it out, and bring in more dirt, dump it down. I was there in 2007. Dirt was still coming in and out. There's an ongoing reaction, non-self-quenching. That term comes to mind, but that's a whole different set of data there. But looking at what happened. Now, the buildings weren't pulverized. That's a close word. I use the word dustify. We saw a process we've never seen before, so we don't have a word for it. Pulverize is a mechanical action. It's from kinetic energy, pounding rocks on rocks, that type of thing. Thermal energy vaporizes something. That doesn't apply either because that implies high heat. The buildings turn to dust in midair. So I'm calling that dustification. I think it's pretty clear what it means. And by definition, it means whatever it was that happened to the towers. Like the toasted cars and all. So it's important just to know what it is that you know that you know that you know, and know that everything else you don't know, and don't fill in that gap with guesses and assumptions, because then you're solving an assumed problem, not the real problem.
Now, they did have some huge pieces of steel, though, that they hauled off very fast. They didn't keep it. They didn't investigate it. It was a crime scene. But not everything was dust.
Oh, right. Not 100% of the building. There was steel there, but not 110 stories worth in times two buildings.
No, I agree with that. That's true.
Yeah, so it wasn't anything like that. That's another, kind of straw man that people say, oh, here's a piece of steel, so she's wrong. I'm not saying that 100% of the steel turned to dust. I'm saying the majority of the building, let's say from the 20th story on up, or just to make sure the detractors, stay under control, say 50% of the building is, turned to dust. But this other issue of all the steel shipped to China, I've yet to see a receipt. Was it shipped before noon? Because I have pictures that were taken before noon on 9/11 where the material's already missing.
Oh yeah, they did get rid of a lot of stuff pretty darn fast.
Could they move it out in 2 hours or an hour and a half?
Probably not.
Right, and it was gone by then. And then came the story that was shipped to China, and that was to explain why there wasn't enough material there.
Mm-hmm.
But the material was gone before the dust cloud blew away, and you could see that there wasn't much left. So
let's go next. Judy,
okay.
Let's take some more for you. They're all lining up. North Carolina we go. Pete, it's your turn. Go ahead.
Thank you, sir. What a wonderful show. It's a thinking person's program. I appreciate the doctor's efforts. Listen, the Nazis in the Third Reich, they weren't getting the traction they needed, so they destroyed the Reichstag. You remember the Reichstag fire? History repeats itself. Then they took off. They had control of Germany, and I really think this is why these buildings, they've got enough brass to knock down Building 7 that wasn't hit by anything. And I appreciate what you guys are doing. Let me get off here. You got more callers. Thanks much.
You're
thank
very
you.
Welcome.
Thanks. I'm a forensic scientist. I look at what happened with the material properties. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I don't look at theories, and I don't look at conspiracies, and so I don't look at conspiracy theories. I look at physical evidence, whether it's about Boeing looking for a new design of an airplane wing, or somebody designing a new truck bed. I look at material properties and materials characterization of what's there.
We go to Angie now in Casa Grande, Arizona. Angie, go ahead. You're on with Dr. Judy Wood.
Hey, George. Thanks for taking my call. How you doing, Judy?
Hi, Angie.
Hi. I just have a couple of comments. They're kind of various, but on the topic we're talking about right now. The other night I listened to a program when you had a guest host filling in for you. I believe her name was it Lisa?
Oh, that's on our weekend show. Yeah, Lisa Gar.
Yes. And she had a wonderful host, and I realized then how much physics I really knew. And man, was I horrible in math in school my whole life, except geometry. And then I realized I could have actually done physics because this guy was amazing, and he was a scientist from Egypt. And for 40 years, he had delved into bioenergy and biosacred energy, and was discussing the fact that regarding the pyramids and whatnot, and that it's not so much what you built, it's where you built it and a sacred energy around it. And the fact that when you guys were talking about the cell phone towers and all that stuff, and there was something going on somewhere in New Zealand where there were cell phone towers, and they added more, and they had to put them in the church of all locations. And for all this time, everybody there, these kids, people weren't be able to conceive. There was a woman with three kids that had epilepsy, which I happen to have. I have the worst epilepsy you can have. And this woman was taking care of 5 kids that had an average of 5 grand mal seizures a day, people with massive headaches, so on and so forth. And so a friend of his called down to Egypt and said, hey, they told them they knew a guy and they wanted you to come out and check this place out. Now, this kind of guy in sacred energy, they deal with quantitative type things, and he was trying to give her examples with like musical notes, and you strike a chord and then you put your finger on another chord. And basically in math, it's an infinity amount of possibilities, right? And she couldn't get the first example with music. He said, okay, well, I'm an engineer, I'm an architect, and I can create anything. But, you know, you got to put it in a place, and you know, they use shapes and things and whatnot to make it, you know, your own. And so it creates peace and everything in your life, and also healthy and all these types of things. And so he went up there, and he asked permission to go in the church because people were starting not to go to church because their heads started hurting and things like that. So he went in there with the permission of the church, and he took out his stuff, and he tried to do wood on these cell phone towers. Obviously, that wasn't working. And I knew before he was going to say it, I said, watch, he's going to go in there, and all he's going to do is redirect that energy somewhere else. And that's exactly what he did. He used plexiglass. And they do have, like, different formations, like triangular and things like that are donuts.
Oh, yeah, they are way ahead, Angie, of just about anything. And this technology, Judy, who do you think possesses it? Now, that's an interesting question. Who has it?
You mean the technology that's, you know, Acme Model XXX available from aisle 17 at the Acme Weapons Store? You know, what... You're jumping way ahead. I'm not talking about theories. I'm talking about evidence of what...
No, but I'm saying who has
does.
it? Who has it? That's my question.
Hey, ask Applied Research Associates. I can tell
Chinese,
you. Tell you.
Did the Chinese have it? Do the Russians have it?
Ask Applied Research Associates.
Are they the only ones who know?
They're ones I you know, have pretty good evidence that they know who has it. That's their job, to know who has it. They're paid by our tax dollars to know.
Did you ever call them?
They were, you know, called to the stand, but then the case was killed.
I mean, you've never gone to their offices or called them wherever they may be.
No.
Where they based?
I had contacted various other, you know, various offices around, some in Florida and some in Vermont and other places, but that's neither here nor there. We're talking about the evidence of what happened. No one can refute what I've presented. What they have is emotional attachments to ideas and theories and speculation, and are unable to look at evidence. Partly because of maybe our educational system, that people begin with theories and work backwards. You know, they look at the answer in the back of the book and work backwards. But why would somebody have a problem with looking at the evidence that I present?
Oh, I don't think anybody should have a problem at looking at what you present. They don't have to agree with it, but they should at least look at it.
Do you agree that the towers are gone, or is that just
No.
somebody's wacky theory?
Are we being silly or what now?
No. The evidence I present is that clear. It's not a theory. It's not imagination. Are the towers gone? You know, and then you look at the seismic signal from a whole bunch of different seismic stations. Is there a lack of appropriate seismic signal? Is there high heat? There wasn't high heat. Thermal energy didn't destroy the buildings. We're talking about destructive mechanism, not what did it. We're talking about the destructive mechanism. Was it kinetic energy? Was it thermal energy? You know, people have often said, oh, she talks about laser beams from outer space. No, that would be thermal energy as a destructive mechanism. We'd be cooking the building to death. It didn't get cooked to death, so we can eliminate any thermal energy.
Regardless of the conclusions you've gotten here, have you ever asked yourself, why did they do this?
I don't speculate, but I can look at what's happened since. And that's when it's become, you know, kind of obvious. People are, you know, utterly traumatized. It was an attack on human consciousness. People shut down the ability to think. I saw that in my colleagues. And
people gave up a lot of rights, too.
That's right. And it numbs the senses, and they allow that kind of thing to happen. And the only way to heal from that is to face what happened. Not to say, okay, instead of bin Laden, let's go after Bush. Or let's go after Cheney, or let's go after... They're not dealing with what the problem is. And how you begin with is you can look at the evidence and see, are the towers gone? And to see that 7 buildings were destroyed that day. Not 1, not 2, not 3, not 4, 7. And they basically went missing. But you had people like, you know, right standing next to it. Like in Building 6, there were some firefighters walking through the lobby when the middle went. And one guy lived and his buddies were gone.
Well, will we ever get the real answers? Judy, thank you so much for being on the program. Dr. Judy Woods, up next, a 3,000-year-old mystery. What does that mean to us? We'll be back. Well, Jonathan Cahn was with me about a year ago as we talked about his work, The Harbinger, the ancient mystery that holds the secret of America's truth, and now the mystery of the Shemitah, the 3,000-year-old mystery that holds the secret of America's future, the world's future, and your future. Stand by on Coast to Coast AM. Welcome back to Coast. Jonathan Cahn back with us. Jonathan is the author of the bestseller, The Harbinger, the ancient mystery that holds the secret of America's future. He's an internationally recognized authority on end-time prophecy, leads the Jerusalem Center, Beth Israel in Wayne, New Jersey, president of Hope of the World, which is an outreach program, and his teachings and messages are heard around the world, and he is known for revealing the deep mysteries of biblical truth. Welcome back, Jonathan Cahn. Jonathan, I had a great time with you when we talked about The Harbinger, and I'm looking forward to this, too. How are you?
Great to be with you. Great, George, and always great to be with you.
Man, are things still heated up in the Middle East? They just don't stop, do they?
No, never. I mean, that's something that has been true for over 2,000 years, and even this is linked to one of the mysteries in The Harbinger. You know, it had to do with the second Harbinger was the sign of the terrorist, and it had to do with literally the ancient Assyrians and Iraq, and this whole thing with ISIS is like a replaying. It's linked to one of the Harbingers, a replaying of that, which is actually very ominous.
The word in your new book, of course, The Mystery of the Shemitah.
Yes.
What does Shemitah mean?
Okay. The Shemitah is it's an ancient Hebrew word, and this began in the Harbinger. It was something called the Mystery of the Harbinger that started with the Mystery of the Shemitah, which is this. It goes back 3,000 years, and it is the every 7th year in the Bible was a Sabbath year. People know about the Sabbath day. A lot of people don't know about the Sabbath year. So every 7th year, there was no reaping, no sowing, no touching of the land. The whole land would rest. There was no buying or selling of anything of the land. And the last day of the Shemitah year, the entire year, when it reaches its peak, it was called Elul 29, and that's basically the Hebrew month Elul, 29th day. On that day, all debt is wiped out, all credit's wiped out, all the financial accounts of the nation is wiped out. Now, this was supposed to be a blessing, but when Israel turned away from God, the Bible says the Shemitah became a sign of judgment on a nation that has driven God out of its life, that's falling away from God, and that strikes the financial realm of that nation. And so when Israel was finally destroyed in 586 BC, when the Babylonians came in, it's called the Babylonian captivity. They were taken for 70 years into exile, and the land rested. And the Bible says that this was according to the mystery of the Shemitah, meaning that the land would rest for all the times this nation broke it. It would rest for 70 years. So the Shemitah becomes this sign of a nation that has turned away from God. Now, the thing is, here's the thing, George. When I wrote The Harbinger, one of the mysteries that began was this thing called the Shemitah. But I really had no idea how big this was until very recently, and this whole book, The Mystery of the Shemitah, was a surprise. I didn't plan on writing this. It was so big. This mystery is behind the rise and fall of the stock market, the rise and fall of the economy, the rise and fall of nations, even the rise of America, and what can be the fall of America. It is behind global cataclysms like the First World War, the Second World War, the atomic age. I mean, it is so big. It has been affecting everyone listening, all of us, since the day we were born. I mean, it is a secret, really, in the Bible of the timing of cataclysms, and it's amazing. I mean, every realm it's affecting, and which I'm sure we'll get into. We're coming to the next Shemitah this month, so we'll talk about that too. Yeah, and I believe we have to be ready.
Does the Shemitah predict the future?
I believe it does, because I mean, not that you can put everything into a box, and not that it has to happen every time, and according to our calendar. But this mystery is so specific, and we'll see. It actually gives dates. It gives. It has actually foretold the crashing of Wall Street. I mean, throughout the 20th century, and even down to the days, to the hours, to the minutes, and to the seconds. I mean, that's how precise this is. So it's kind of given the right circumstances, it manifests. And I believe we are right now in, I'll say right circumstances or wrong, we are at a very dangerous moment in this. And George, you have people who spend fortunes trying to find out what the stock market's going to do. Well, this is amazing because truly, and I'll show you how it does. It has determined it. I mean, time after time after time, and even events such as 9/11, even events such as the attack of terror. So with the one caveat that you can't put God in a box, but given the circumstances, this mystery is so precise that I'm cautious about giving dates. But in the book, I actually do give dates. But with it doesn't have to happen that way, but it may very likely, because this is the pattern.
Wow.
Yeah, I'll give you some examples here. First of all, the one of the keys to unlocking this mystery, first, is this 7-year cycle. That's the first thing. The second thing is this date that I mentioned, Elul 29, when everything was wiped out in the financial realm. The other thing is the Hebrew month called Tishri, which is around September, October. I mean, we're entering into it, and that's the month in this mystery that would manifest this financial wipeout. That's the peak month of the year called the Shemitah. Now, here are some things just to get a taste of this. First one, in the last 50 years, or I'll say last 40 years, we have had 5 major financial collapses or long-term collapses. I'm talking about it often leads to recession, but the stock market reaches its peak and collapses. 5 of them. One was in 1973, second in 1980, third in 1987, fourth in 2000, and fifth in 2007, the Great Recession. Now, if you look at that, just without knowing anything, you've got 1973 to 80.
And we don't count 2001, or do we? Because of 9/11.
Well, here's the thing. The Shemitah, it doesn't go according to the Western calendar, so it actually goes from September to September. So it is going to go into 2001. Here's the thing. With all these things, you got 73 to 80. That's a 7-year cycle. 80 to 87. That the next crash cycle, 7-year cycle. 2000, 2007 cycle, 7 years. And not only are they 7-year cycles, but they are the exact 7-year cycles of the ancient Shemitah. So in other words, the economy has crashed every single time in the last 40 years. Every single major long-term crash has happened according to this ancient mystery, which has to do with the crashing of the economy to start with, it will also include 9/11, which I'll touch on. But now, George, if you look at the top and say a bigger picture, look at the top greatest crashes, long-term crashes of the entire 20th century. I mean, I don't include the Great Depression and other. The majority of them happen in the year of the Shemitah. The majority. And for instance, with the Great Depression, it reaches its peak in 1931 is considered the peak. When the Shemitah reaches its peak at this exact day, it ushers in the greatest month-long collapse in American history and of the Great Depression. The second of the greatest long-term crashes was 2007 and 2008. Well, 2007 and 2008, the Great Recession, is the exact time period of the Shemitah. Exactly. The number 3 is 1937-1938 crash, and this is what happens here. The Shemitah begins. The next day, Wall Street collapses. Gosh. It's exact. And if you go, here's another thing. If you go, for instance, to the single day crashes, like look at they don't have some of the big crashes, but look at the greatest single day crashes, and are any of them linked to the Shemitah? The answer is the majority of them. The majority of them. In fact, the majority of the greatest crashes take place all clustered around one time of the year, and that one time of the year is that month, I said, is the month of Tishri, which is the month that's ordained from ancient times for these crashes. And, one thing, I don't know if you've noticed, and people who look at the stock market, there's always been this mystery that around the time of autumn, September, October, come all these great crashes, Black Monday, Black Tuesday, and for ages, economists have been trying to figure out what's the reason, and they thought it was because the farmers were getting paid at that time, but that changed, so nothing has ever stuck. But the amazing thing is that's the exact time, that September-October period is the month of Tishri, which is ordained from 3,000 years ago in the Bible, that this is the time when this wipeout happens. And if you look at, for instance, the Great Depression, Black Monday is Tishri 24, Black Tuesday, Tishri 25. 1987, Black Monday, the wipeout, one of the greatest actually percentage stock market crash, is Tishri 26. So they're all, in fact, the majority, or 60%, the majority of the greatest single-day crashes, percentage crashes, all cluster around 18 days on the biblical calendar. They all happen with it, and it's the time that is linked to Tishri. I mean, and that goes against all odds, but it is exactly what is ordained in this mystery. I'll give you another one here, and this is just the beginning, because the financial realm is just the beginning. This affects history and everything else.
Right, not just financial stuff.
Yeah. I mean, even terror attacks, even world wars, even Hitler. I mean, I'm going to just touch on some of the things, but one of them, for instance, this key date, Elul 29, which is when this wipeout is ordained. If you look at the top 5, now I'm talking about point crashes, so this is volume crashes. The top 5 stock market point crashes in history, all of them, or how many are linked or happen right around this date of Elul 29? 100% of them.
100%.
100. In fact, 2 of them happen on the day. 100% of them. And when you look at the proximity of these great crashes, the ratio is over 99% close to this day.
Do you have the date for the next crash, Jonathan?
Okay, I will. I promise you, George.
We will get it. Okay.
I promise you, we'll get towards that. I'm not saying that it has to happen, but I will say when this period is. And the thing, the thing about it also is that this phenomenon is intensifying, and that's one of the things that could be very scary for people. It's getting more and more intense, and I'll show you how this is. In the year 2001, and you alluded to it, but that was not only the time of 9/11, that was also the greatest point crash in American history. That up to that date, it was actually caused by 9/11. It was September 17th. Greatest crash. When did the greatest crash in American history take place? It happened on the day of the Shemitah, Elul 29, exactly down to the hours, the day appointed to wipe out the financial accounts and link to a nation in danger of judgment. That's the first thing. But then that record lasted for years until it was finally broken in the collapse of the Great Recession in 2008. And that happened in September. And so what you have there, it happened on September 29th, 2008. You got the greatest crash in American history to this day. And what happened is when they went into Wall Street that morning, they went to ring the bell, but the bell refused to ring, literally. Literally. And the people
what
on
an
Wall
omen.
Street, they took it as an omen. And you had that is the absolute greatest crash in American history. And it broke the record. Well, when did that take place? That greatest other crash happened on the exact same ancient day appointed in the Bible, Elul 29, the day of nullification. The 2 greatest crashes in American history each happened on the exact same day. That's beyond odds. And they each happened 7 years apart, according to the mystery. In fact, 7 biblical years apart, down to the day, down to the hour, down to the minute, down to the second. I mean, exactly as ordained. And George, this thing has been ordained from the time of Moses. That's how amazing it is. And nobody could have put this together. And on top of it, and this is also a warning, and because we are, as we're saying, I promise you we're getting to where we're going. But the thing is that you got this really amazing thing, too, because one of the things about the Shemitah is it's this mystery of sevens. It's about 7 year. It's the 7th month. It's all these sevens. That's the key of it. And you find the fingerprints of this mystery because when you look at the greatest crash in 2001, when that happened because of 9/11, how much of Wall Street was wiped out? 7% of Wall Street was wiped out. In 2008, how much was wiped out? 7% was wiped out. How many points were wiped out in 2008? 777. I mean, it's filled with that. So it is something that has been progressing. It's actually getting more and more intense, and that's why, as we're leading up, to what's coming, and again, I'm not, going to say it has to happen in this particular way, but we are very shortly beginning the next Shemitah year, and the pattern. I'll talk about the future. The pattern tends to be it is at the end of the year, according to the biblical pattern, that it builds to this crescendo. But one of the mysteries here is that in Hebrew, the word for Shemitah literally means the collapse. I mean, it can be translated a few ways, but one of the ways is the fall or the collapse. And the warning is not only of a financial thing, but because what we're going to see also is that America itself, its rise and its potential fall are all also timed to the Shemitah. And so it is a warning of a coming collapse, not just of the financial realm, but a potential collapse of America.
And with these warnings, does that mean it will be, or it must be, or it could be?
I believe that it is very likely that it will be. And does it have to be? I would say no, because we still have free will. But the thing is that at this. But the way it's going, I believe that it is very likely that we are going to, there will be a great shaking, and we can get into the detail of that. But I believe there's going to be a great shaking. How that happens, there's free will involved, but there's also, I mean, that's the amazing thing, because if you look at like any of the things I just mentioned, and this is just one part of the mystery, you see that for these things to happen, you had to have every transaction, every stock market transaction, every buying and selling, every investing, every hunch had to be exactly in its place for this to happen. I mean, so it's just really, it's mind-boggling. On one hand, you have free will, but you also have this ancient mystery that keeps going.
This is fascinating but scary, Jonathan, at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends where, people take it a few different ways. One is that, you can say it's scary. On the other hand, you can look at it another way and say, well, you know what? Things are under control. At the same time, there is a plan, there is a pattern as well. And, it kind of depends where you're at. I mean, I think if, there are people, if the stock market collapses, for some it's very scary, but if you're prepared, and I'm not just speaking about the stock market, but if you're prepared for shaking, I think it's a whole different story. And that's part of the whole reason for this.
You can track Jonathan's work, of course, with his website, theharbingerwebsite.com, which is linked up for you at coasttocoastam.com. His earlier book was called The Harbinger. It's a bestseller. He was on with me back in March of 2013. There's a Shemitah date right there. And then the mystery of the Shemitah, the 3,000-year-old mystery. We'll be back with more in just a moment on Coast to Coast AM. Jonathan Cahn with us. We're talking about his latest work, The Mystery of the Shemitah. And we'll be back with more. I want to get those dates soon. We'll put them on our calendar. Next on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast. Jonathan Cahn with us, of course. We're talking about his work, The Mystery of the Shemitah. Jonathan, who determines the dates, these critical dates you've been talking about? Do you interpret them, or are they clearly right out there?
No, that's a great question. No, they're out there because they wait, hold on. I'm sorry. They are from ancient times. That they actually the rabbis determined it from really even the destruction of the temple in 70 A.D. So they are there. They're objective. There's no debate over when the Shemitah is.
Okay, so let's talk about some of the events. We'll get into dates in a moment. We've got a couple more hours with you here, hour and a half. So we'll get into the dates, and I want to make sure people write them down. But what are the you mentioned beyond economic disasters, that there were other things that could happen that the Shemitah basically spells out, or how does that work?
Well, in the example from the Bible, when this cataclysmic event happened in 586 BC, the Bible says it was time to the Shemitah, and it was literally the wiping out of the ancient kingdom of Israel. And it involved the rising of empires, Babylon and Persia. So what it's saying is that even world history and the rise and fall of nations are timed to this mystery. I'll give you an example. The word, as I said, the word Shemitah can mean the collapse. It can mean the fall, and it can also mean the shaking, as in here, the shaking of nations. One of the Shemitahs is 1917. 1917 is a year of cataclysmic shaking in the world. It's the first World War to begin with, and it's really the turning point of that war. And at that time, you not only have the shaking of nations going on, you've got the collapse. The word means collapse. The collapse of empires: the Ottoman Empire, the German Empire, the Russian Empire, all collapsing. And at the same time, you have the rising of this other power, the rising of America. 1917 is linked to the beginning of America's rise. It enters the war, and it's the beginning of the rise to superpower. And from that event, what happens is the economic center of the world shifts from Europe to America, linked to this war. So you've got all these things like shaking and changing. That's what happens when the Shemitah comes. Now, there's this cycle. If you go 4 Shemitas into the future, or that's 28 years, and there's this cycle of 4. I won't get into the reason why, but it goes continuously. It takes you to another Shemitah year, which is another cataclysmic global shaking, which is 1945. And 1945, of course, it's the climax of the Second World War. And even that war, even World War II, which really, before the war is declared, the beginning, as Hitler starts taking over Europe and Austria and Czechoslovakia, happens in 1938. That's the beginning that's the Shemitah before it. It follows a 7-year cycle from the first aggression to the climax of the war. And in fact, even the Holocaust follows the pattern of the Shemitah. It begins, you have 1938, you have Kristallnacht, you have the first deportations. It's known as the fateful year of the Holocaust. It goes till 1945, that is the cycle of the Shemitah, the 7-year cycle, when it ends. In fact, as the Shemitah is reaching its peak month, its peak day, the war reaches the same thing. As it gets to that final month, which is really the crescendo of the Shemitah, it always builds up. You have the dropping of the atomic bombs. You have this. You talk about nullification. You have this whole thing happening, and the war ends. If you had to take a chart of proximity, it ends in the 99 point something. I don't have it here in front of me. It's paralleling the Shemitah. In fact, when the Allies have their victory parade a few days after Japan surrenders, September 7th, that's sealing the war. That's the exact date of the end of the Shemitah. And so you've got that, and what it also does is it brings America to the height of superpower in 1945. You got a new world order. It's based on the dollar, called Bretton Woods. All begins with this Shemitah, this shaking of nations. You have the collapse of the British Empire. You got this, in other words, another gigantic cataclysm of world history. If you take this down and you go 4 Shemitahs ahead, it takes you to 1973, which is the Shemitah also means the fall, and you can see a real pivotal year in America of falling. You've got a collapse of the economy, but you also have the first war that America ever loses, at least in the modern age, and it happens in Vietnam. And America, the day of that loss is August 15th, which is exactly the same date that America won the World War II in the other Shemitah. You have this whole thing going on. The world order, the economic world order called Bretton Woods, that began in 1945 based on the dollar and the gold standard, it completely collapses in 1973. And the other thing is that when America reaches its peak of world power in 1945, a building is conceived, a tower to really commemorate it, and that tower that's conceived is the World Trade Center. That's when it's first conceived. And in 1973, the next Shemitah, it is finished. If you go now 4 more Shemitahs, it takes you to the year 2001. And the tower that was conceived in the one is now destroyed, 9/11. And the thing about the Shemitah, when this thing happens, and you alluded to 2001, this was a year of the Shemitah. And remember, the Shemitah can mean many things, but one thing is it's shaking. It can mean collapse. And so literally not just the collapse of the stock market, which is what you have then in 2001, but you have the literal collapse of real things, of reality.
Is it always a calamity with the Shemitah?
It is, and that's where it is often a calamity. It's often a shaking, and it depends, and here's the given circumstances, given that where the nation is or where things are, that's what kind of determines how it is. Like, for instance, with America, even though it was a calamity in World War I and World War II and for most of the world, at the same time, it also lifted America to power. It can mean the rise of one power and the collapse of the other. But it's often that, and when you combine this, because in 2001, you literally have the collapse of towers, of real things. And, one of the things, the Shemitah also means to let fall. So you have this symbol of America, and you have this collapse. And this is now comes together with, we talked about it last time, but the mystery of the harbinger, and that is that, that these are now signs of warning, of danger, of judgment, coming or converging with the Shemitah now, and which is again coming very shortly. So you have all these things together, and one of the things is that it's not only that we could see the collapse of the economy, but we can see the changing of world powers. We're at a real critical point. And really, the kind of warning is that the American age that we've known for most of our lives, and that really came into existence, is linked to the Shemitah, could end, and that ending could be also linked to the Shemitah. Now, I'm not saying it has to be this one, but it could. And the other thing is, one of the mysteries, of this, and in the book, is called the mystery of the towers. And this is a link, it's an ancient thing, and that is that in the ancient language, in Hebrew, the word for tower means greatness, and it can also mean pride. It's linked to that. So there's this mystery that when a nation is rising to its point of power, that it's often linked to the erecting of these high towers. And America erected the highest tower or skyscraper, really the first skyscraper in the world, in the year 1870. And that year, by 1871, America had overtaken the British Empire, became the strongest economy on earth. And from that moment on, America was building the highest towers in the world. I mean, from that moment, it kept getting higher and higher as America kept getting higher and higher. But then, you reach this thing. I mentioned the World Trade Center, which again was conceived in 1945, year of the Shemitah. They began building it in 1966, also the year of the Shemitah. It was built until 1973, finished, year of the Shemitah. Its entire building was the 7-year cycle of the Shemitah, and then it's destroyed in the year of the Shemitah. And if the rising of towers, speak of the rising of nations, what is the falling of a tower speak of?
And it seems, Jonathan, though, that after every Shemitah moment, collapse, there's this regeneration. We seem to always come back. Is that the case all the time, or could there be, and you kind of alluded to it, that a collapse and this could be it?
Well, that's a great question. Actually, if you looked on a graph, if you looked at the graph of the economy, you'd see exactly what you just said. You see the crash at the time, at the peak of the Shemitah, you see the crash. And then within, a year or 2 years, depending on how major that is, you start seeing now another rise, which also is a biblical pattern because, accounts would rise, all these things would rise up, and then they would be cut off. But if something is severe, something can be severe, a crash can be severe to the point where you don't have at least the immediate recovery, where it gives lasting, a lasting, in a sense, damage or a lasting change of power. Because, for instance, when you look at some of these Shemitahs I talked about, some of these powers never recover, at least they never recover as the world leader, like the British Empire, all these empires collapse. So even though there can be recovery, it can be a change of literally of the landscape of the world. And, one of the things about this too, and what we're going is, one of the harbingers is this tower that they are building. You talk about, collapse and then building. Yeah. Well, another tower is going up. And now this was, remember, when this warning came in ancient Israel before its destruction, they responded by saying, we're going to build higher and bigger. After this warning attack happened, like their 9/11, we're going to build higher and bigger. Well, we've been building this tower since 9/11. But it's been taking so long. It looks like this is going to be completed in the year of the Shemitah. That's what it looks like. And the thing is that, there is a warning in this because, in the Bible, this omen of this tower kind of being built in defiance was actually a sign of judgment. So you've got even that coalescing at the same time. And, you have all these things coming together, at this coming time. And one of the things we I don't know if we mentioned, but in Ground Zero, this is after I wrote The Harbinger. In Ground Zero, they found a scripture hidden in there, and the scripture was the scripture of the Tower of Babel. Literally, it was, "Come, let us build for ourselves a tower," which kind of goes along with the whole warning of the Harbinger. And this is the same tower that the president, when he came, this is also after the Harbinger came out, the president goes down to ground zero and he writes, they say write words that are going to be the final, the highest words on that tower. And he writes, without realizing it, he writes a version of this ancient prophecy of Isaiah 9:10 of war, which is speaking of judgment. So I'm just throwing this in here, I would keep my eyes on that tower, and because this is also linked to, the tower speaks of rising, but the Shemitah speaks of falling, and we are coming to that point. So, there is really, we are at I will say, we are at a critical point, and the Shemitah is all concerned about timing. It even has really the secret of end-time events that have to do with the Middle East. We have time, I'll touch on it. And the other thing is that, in the Bible, and I'm not saying that this always has to be, but one of the signs of judgment or disaster is the darkening of the sun. That's one of the things in the Scriptures. And I'm not saying that every eclipse means that this is a sign of judgment, but interesting, because in 2015, that there will be two eclipses of the sun, and the one eclipse is going to be in the springtime. It's going to mark the exact center point of the Shemitah. I mean, the day that marks the center, and the other eclipse is going to mark the day of the final day, the climactic day of the Shemitah, which is the day when basically wipeout of nullification. So you even have things like that coming together. So, there's really so much. And, there are people who look at the blood moons, and I'm not, saying one way or the other, but the blood moon period, that's all, from here on in, is all going to be the year of the Shemitah. It's going to all coalesce with this year. And the year is beginning shortly.
How did you find the Shemitah? How did you even know about it? Through your religious training?
Well, I've known most, say, Bible students know about something called the Sabbath year, but they don't really know. I mean, most people don't really know that this is still observed. Like in Israel, they're actually, the Orthodox Jews will actually cancel out their debts to each other symbolically. But the thing is, I didn't realize what happened was, I was seeing these things about the Harbinger and these signs of danger and judgment that are there, and the economy collapsed. Now in 2008, it collapsed. And it collapsed just before they sounded the trumpets for Rosh Hashanah, Feast of Trumpets, because on that climactic day, that's when you have Rosh Hashanah at nighttime. But the stock market collapsed just before the trumpets. I knew there was something, and something said, this is kind of with a harbinger, like I wasn't looking for anything, but something said, you have to seek this out, there's something there. And I didn't know what was there. But then I said, oh my God, this is the exact day when this has to be wiped out. And then only after that, that I find the other greatest crash was exactly on the same day in 2001, and it was to the same minute. I mean, one of the things is that this thing has to happen before sundown, and all these things happen just before sundown, same time. And, this is something that, again, I didn't really know, a lot until I saw it there, but the timing was so exact that because the crash in 2001 was actually caused by 9/11. So what that means, the ramifications are that even the timing of 9/11 had to happen exactly as it did. They froze the market, they reopened it on the day of the Shemitah. So even that had to be part of the ancient mystery.
2008, of course, collapsed after the housing bubble burst.
Yep.
And that went relatively fast, too. I looked at some stocks. I never bought them, Jonathan, but there was one that went down to $1.41. It's selling at $80 a share today, which means it's got the same potential to go back to $1.41 again if this happens again. Yeah.
That's another thing. And that one of the things about this phenomenon is that when all these kind of bubble levels, when they go higher, that's when the debt of America goes higher, which already is. That's when this phenomenon of the Shemitah hits, so precisely and so hard. And really, when you think about it, biblically, that's what it did. It was the wiping away of debt, So that's kind of what you see in the stock market. I mean, it's so precise. I'll give you this is kind of a mystical example here. That when the stock market collapsed, it was in 2008. It was, as I said, 777. If you take that mark, you take that moment of that 777, because the Shemitah holds the mystery of timing. Go back 7 years, it brings you to the exact moment of the other crash, 7 Hebrew years, the exact closing bell. You have the crash of 2001 on that moment, 4 o'clock. And if you go back from that moment 7 days, it takes you to the day of 9/11, September 11th. And if you go back 7 hours, it takes you to the hour of 9/11. I mean, it's so precise. I mean, it's so precise. So, yeah, and I think, I'm not a financial analyst. Personally, I would not be putting my trust in the stock market as we head towards this year. That's
all right. We're going to get some dates. We're going to take this break. We're going to come back. We're going to take phone calls, continue chatting with Jonathan Cahn, but we're going to get into some specific dates that you can just circle on your calendar. We'll be back. The Shemitah, the mystery of the Shemitah. Let's get some dates from Jonathan so we can predict what we're going to do next on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast. George Norrie with you, Jonathan Cahn as well. We'll get to your calls in a second. Jonathan, so let's pull out the old calendar. What do we have here? What do you see as... Now, does the Shemitah tell you what the event is, or does it only give you dates of certain things?
It gives, well, if, for instance, the last two times, the last two Shemitahs, you have exact dates and you have exact events. In fact, the events are really parallels of each other. In many cases, they are this financial collapse. But, for instance, in 9/11, you have the event being caused by a non-financial event, but by this terrorist cataclysm. So, the general overall is that of collapse, of change, there's several characteristics of the form the Shemitah may take. I have a few pages on that. It can, in the book, it can go a few ways, but I believe we're talking about a collapse in several ways of what's coming for this particular one. And now I do want to give you or the listeners, one caution. Again, I don't want to put God in a box, and I don't, say that something has to happen at this time. There are times when certain things do not manifest on the Shemitah, and then it does the next one. But again, it has been increasing. So I will tell you what the dates are. I'll tell you also what I think is going to happen to begin with. The date of the Shemitah, the beginning of the Shemitah, is September. This is now. It's September 25th. That is the first day of the Shemitah. Okay. Easy for me to remember because it happens to be my birthday this year. So
happy upcoming birthday, John.
Yes, and it actually begins the night. Every biblical day begins the night before. So it starts the 24th, and sundown goes to then starts on. Now, one of the patterns is that generally the big change, if something is going to happen in this Shemitah, it doesn't have to, but if it is, it generally does not manifest at the beginning, but manifests towards the end, just like in the last two cases. In the case of 2007, when it began, that's when the Shemitah began, it went to 2008. Within 1 month of the beginning, the stock market that had been rising for years starts turning and going down. Now, if you weren't really, attuned to it, you might miss it, and yet that was going to end up in the biggest collapse, since the Depression. But you had the shifting of momentum, and the last two Shemitahs, you would not have noticed it necessarily, but things did shift. But then another date you have is the very center point of the Shemitah, which is going to be a solar eclipse, and that is March 20th. That is the exact center point, and you have this solar eclipse. But if something is going to happen in this period, that it's most likely going to be as you get towards the end of the Shemitah, because that's when the Shemitah reaches its climax, always. And so what we're talking about is September of 2015, or the autumn of 2015. Now, when in the last collapse in the Great Recession in 2008, things started increasing as you headed towards September. You had the collapse of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and
Lehman
Brothers.
Coming, right? You feel, okay.
You could, that's it. You could see it coming in 2000 and 2008. Now, in 2001, the economy was already in a slide, or the stock market was in a slide. But you probably wouldn't have seen 9/11 coming unless you looked at some other biblical things. That's the harbingers. But so there's variation. But then the final, the climactic day, which if it happens at that time, is Elul 29 of 2015, which in English is September 13th, 2015. Now, one of the things is that sometimes when you've had collapses in the past, they've happened, or you've had traumatic events, they've happened in that period, sometimes just before it, and sometimes just after. And the month of Tishri is often a month of cataclysm, because that's the one that follows it. But in the last two, you had it exactly on that day. So now, the interesting thing, George, if there is something, is that it's going to be, this time it happens on a Sunday, so you cannot have a stock market crash in America. But at the same time, as with 9/11, that may point to having another cataclysmic thing that is beyond the stock market, but then affects it. The last day that the stock market will be open before this Elul 29 day will be Friday, September 11th, the anniversary of September 11th.
Boy. Okay.
Yeah.
That's bizarre.
Yeah, and then the other thing is that that I said that you had this solar eclipse happening on this exact biblical day, Elul 29. Well, the last time that happened, and this is not speculation, and I've had financial people come to me about these things. The last time you had the solar eclipse on Elul 29, the day of nullification of on the Shemitah, it led to Black Monday, which it was 1987 when you had the greatest percentage collapse in American history. Another time when you had it just about that time, eclipse, was 1931. And it was just at that, within that day or two, and you had the greatest month-long collapse. It was the Great Depression. So, not saying it has to happen, but those are the key time periods. Now, I do believe, and I will say this, whenever it happens, whether it happens in this period or not, I do believe, sense very strongly for many reasons, there is going to be a great shaking in America and the world, and it will affect the financial realm. It will affect the economic realm. It may not be limited to those realms. There may be another event connected to it, but I believe it's going to be a great shaking, and that's one of the reasons why I wrote the Shemitah. I mean, I don't know. I'm very cautious, but at the same time, as I give the dates, and charts and other things too. But I do believe we do need to be ready, and we do need to be prepared.
Now, when you say shaking, could that be an earthquake?
You know what? A shaking can take that as well. And I think one time when you and I were talking, we were talking about how does shaking or how does judgment or warnings come? And one way they can come is exactly that. It can be a natural disaster. It can be a man-made disaster, as in terrorism, as we watched. It can be, of course, economic. I believe that either way, that economic and financial will be involved, but I don't believe it necessarily will be limited to that. And one of the things, combined with this, is that the harbingers are progressing and continuing. Last time we spoke, I mentioned to you about that tree, that seventh harbinger was called the Erez tree, the tree that they planted at Ground Zero. And one of the signs in the Bible of the warning, because this was a symbol of America, is the withering away of a tree. Well, that tree was withering away, and since I last spoke to you, that tree, the seventh harbinger, has been destroyed. They destroyed the tree because they could not say it's destroyed, and they destroyed it on a Hebrew holiday of all things. So all these things keep going. I just heard the president talk. I was actually in the Capitol building the night when the president was speaking, and he, interesting, when he spoke, and here is the eve of 9/11, and he's speaking about ISIS, and when he speaks, he specifically mentions the last two shakings of America that are part of the Harbinger and part of the Shemitah. He says this is the 13th anniversary of course, 9/11. That's the first shaking. And then he says, and then we're coming to the anniversary well, he says the 6th anniversary, which means we're only 1 year away from the 7th there, of the economic collapse. And these are, when you look, and between the two, between 9/11 and that first shaking, and then the shaking of our economy, it's the 7-year cycle, and it's the Shemitah, and the president, without realizing it, he alludes to it. And one of the other mysteries that begins in the Harbinger, but I believe is linked to this, is that when Israel got its warning and its shaking, and then came ultimately judgment, the judgment came, or the great calamity came, through the same people who brought the first shaking. In other words, it was an attack of terror, and it had to do with literally Iraq, literally the land of Iraq. And Israel got involved with the shaking came from Iraq, and then they got involved with a second war with Iraq, or with these who really the beginnings of terrorism, and that's when the final thing, or that's when the great judgment came. So it's a little bit ominous. It's all happening. It's all also happening. The anniversary of 9/11, and that the president also alludes to these things. And one of the things that we saw with the principle of the Harbinger and the Shemitah is that weirdly or eerily, you have these leaders, reenacting these things and saying these things without realizing what they're saying.
All right. Now, if I'm hearing you right, September 25th of this year, all the way through September 13th of next year, we've got that window. But you think that if anything happens, it's going to be closer to the September 11, 12, 13 date of next year, correct?
That is correct. I believe if something is to be for this one, the pattern will be towards the end, and the final end is September 13th. And it often, when in the past, has carried into that month period of Tishri, which follows that September 13th.
So are we going to have a boom year this year?
Well, here's the pattern. Not necessarily. There can be, but what in the last Shemitah, you had this boom, which happened, began with the fall of the Shemitah before it,
right.
and it went a little bit past the beginning of the Shemitah, and it was within 30 days when it started turning, when the stock market started turning, and then by the end of that year, you had the crescendo of all this. So it is possible that it could continue, but it also is possible that you could see in the last two, you'd see the beginning of a shift of a momentum. But then the dramatic thing happens at the end, at least in the last two.
All right, let's take some calls for you. We've got Donna in Riverside, California to get things started. Hey, Donna, go ahead.
Hallelujah. Thank you.
Sure.
First, I heard just three quick things. I heard Jesus was crucified on the Shemitah. And what do you think of the Bible code theory? And would it also give links to the end times? And one last thing is, I heard a man a few years ago who was related to somebody in the New World Order said they were planning indentured servitude. And given the maniacal tendencies of some of these leaders, do you think that's possible? Thank you, and God bless you for your work.
Thank you. Wow. Okay. I've heard, there are those who speculated that it was that Jesus was crucified on the Shemitah. We can't tell when the Shemitah. We do know that there was a Shemitah year just before the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, and you can count backwards, and it kind of depends when the dating for the crucifixion. It could be 30 AD, 33 AD, somewhere around there. So it would depend on that. As far as what this. There's something Jordan didn't even mention. It's in the epilogue of the book, and it's linked to the end times, because the Shemitah also continuously through the Bible and onward in prophecy contains really the secret of the timing of things. And in fact, you talk about the 7-year tribulation. Well, that's a 7-year period. That's a Shemitah. But one of the mysteries that also is converging in this coming year is, in the book, it's called The Mystery of the Seventh Shemitah. And when you got to the seventh Shemitah, or 7 sevens, that's 49 years, that would lead into the Jubilee. And the Jubilee is linked to the Shemitah. I mean, you can't have it without it. In fact, the Jubilee is like a super Shemitah. It's a time where everything is restored, very positive, and people return to their their ancestral possession. They return home. They get, with a lost land, they get it restored. Well, the Jubilee always has to happen after a year of the Shemitah, because you got 49, you got the 7th Shemitah, and then you get the 50th year. So it's always going to be in the year after the Shemitah. What does that have to do with prophecy or end times? Well, here's the thing. Was there the key moment in end time prophecy is the restoration of Israel as was predicted, and the first time that the Jewish people were restored to the land, or the land was given to them, it was called the Balfour Declaration. It was at the end of World War I, and it was 1917. Well, if you look at that, the time when that happened, it was in the year following the Shemitah. That has to be the year of restoration. So you have this Jubilee, you have this restoration of the land, and you have all this thing of the Jubilee. Well, now what happens if you count 7 Shemitahs from that restoration, from that kind of prophetic Jubilee? If you count 7 Shemitahs from around 1917, it takes you to 1966, September 1966. The year after is September 1966 to September 1967. Did anything happen significantly? Well, that's when you have the other restoration, the restoration of Jerusalem, the Six-Day War, which is another prophetic key. So you've got this thing following the same exact pattern, exactly 50 years in this whole thing. But here's the other part of it, and again, I'm not saying it has to be, but if you follow from that last one and you go 7 Shemitahs forward, or the 7 sevens, where does it take you? It takes you to the Shemitah of 2014 and 2015, where we are coming to, and the next year would then be that. So if that would be the Jubilee. So if that follows, it could mean there could be something very significant happening linked to the Middle East as well, and the pattern is actually it always happens through war and a major prophetic event. So I'm just throwing this in. It's one of the things, the 7th Shemitah, that's also part of the Shemitah, the mystery of what's coming.
Let's go to Anthony in Philadelphia. Get you in here, Anthony. Thanks for calling. Go ahead.
Good morning, yes. Hi. The last show you had this gentleman who was a seer, and he predicted all of these things happening. Now you have a show where you got the Shemitah is lining up with everything throughout the years. It's lining up perfectly. Well, but then your gentleman says it doesn't have to be, and the gentleman on the show yesterday said that it doesn't have to happen if man can turn everything around. But it just seems to me that man cannot be depended upon to turn everything around, because if he could, he would, and you would not have all these things happening constantly lining up with one another, and there would not be an end of times then. It just seems to me that man cannot be dependent upon to turn things around, because he is basically a defective species that is always going to screw things up, basically. Which is
you may be right there, Anthony. Man does screw things up a lot. So, Jonathan, when you look at all of this, maybe he's right. Maybe we can't change it because we're not capable of changing it.
Well, it's you got the mystery of free will and predestination, and they go together. Ultimately you have prophecies that I believe are going to come true, and at the same time you have here this really precise pattern. I believe because we are messed up, and I agree, that will most likely lead to these things happening. My feeling is whether, that it could very well be in this timing. But I'm always just cautious to step back to say, again, I don't want to put God in a box. But I do believe, again, as I stated, and I'm cautious about it, but I clearly believe there is a very great shaking coming.
Well, a big shaking indeed. Jonathan, we're going to watch the calendar. We're going to come back in a moment and take final calls with you right here on Coast to Coast AM. Well, on our next Coast to Coast program, our colleagues, of course, will be filling in for me. I do believe we have Richard Surrett tomorrow from Toronto. I've got some personal family business, which you're all aware of, that I must tend to. I will be back Monday in Los Angeles, and the team will keep things going. We'll be back in a moment with our guest, Jonathan Kahn, as we talk about the mystery of the Shemitah on Coast to Coast AM. Welcome back to Coast. Jonathan Kahn with us, of course. Jonathan, if people want to pick up the book, The Mystery of the Shemitah, where do they go?
The book just came out last week, and so it is everywhere from Amazon to Walmart to Barnes & Noble, really everywhere, where books are sold. I was just told it's kind of like the third book in Amazon. It's the third book in the world, third highest book. So it just went out, and this is really one of the first interviews I'm doing. So.
Well, good. You're doing a great job. Let's go back to the phones. Bob is in Maui in Hawaii. Bob, go ahead. Thanks for calling.
Well, George, can you hear me?
I sure can.
Aloha.
Yeah, you too.
Well, anyway, here I am. It's been about a year since I talked to you last time. I guess it was when Walter Christensen came over here, and I took him up to see the petroglyphs, and within a half a mile of where I live. I have an estate up here. But anyway, the reason I called, I think you have, I haven't called for a while because, I won't go into that. But I think what you have is a guy on today that really knows what he's doing, Jonathan. He's really a smart man. Today's my birthday.
Well, happy birthday.
Happy birthday.
Well, no, I'm not sure. It's 9/11, and so that's a hard one for me. Anyway, I'm going to be my next birthday, I'll be 80 years old. Do I sound like that? No. I'm a lucky man, right, Jonathan and George?
You sure are.
Yep. Yes, and I think a lot of it has to do with living over here. But here's the thing I wanted to direct to George, and I did talk a little bit to your screener, and he's a great guy. Of course, I've talked to him before. Now, here's the thing. We're worried so much about these EMPs, right?
Mm-hmm.
Why don't we use an EMP on the ISIS guys, for God's sake? Why? In the old days, we used to, the old days, like 1,000 years ago, we used to set up a perimeter around a camp that we were trying to take, or a castle, and we would just starve them out.
Well, let me explain that, Bob, and then I want to concentrate on Jonathan because we don't have a lot of time here. An EMP will not physically hurt somebody. It only takes out electrical grids and power systems and things like that. And the ISIS folks, they're probably running around without the need for that. So that would not work. But back to you, Jonathan, and this incredible work of the Shemitah. What's behind it? Is it prophecy? Is it God? What's fueling it?
Yeah, I would think, first of all, it's all the above. It was given initially from Mount Sinai, literally through Moses. So this was a pattern, a law that was given. It's a pattern. It is something that operates in the supernatural and the natural. Because it's just too much to be explained by anything. And given the right circumstances, it becomes, as I said, it becomes a sign, or can become a sign of warning and judgment. It is ultimately, if you talk to the rabbis, they'll say, the Shemitah was showing that really God is in charge of everything, and He owns everything. So it was originally going to be, again, a blessing, turn away from the worldly things and turn back to God. It was it was a Sabbath. But again, that's where, in this case, it becomes a sign of judgment, and that's where it gets a bit scary. So, and the thing is, we're talking about a 3,500-year-old thing that is affecting things to this day. And I want to just throw in, because we've had a few things the people along these lines saying this, that is that, regardless of what has to be, that doesn't say how each of us have to be. In other words, you can have things happening around you, but how you respond makes a difference. There's a verse that says, calamity comes, but the wise person prepares for it, and that's really the reason I wrote the book. And and the same with the Harbinger. It's sounding an alarm, but so that we can get ready. If people say, is there hope? Well, if there was no hope, there'd be no warning. What's the point of warning if there's no hope? So it's really how we respond to it, and us getting right and getting ready and getting prepared and right with God. And so that's really the whole point of all of it. And so you don't have to fear, but you have to be right.
Okay, let's go next to Anita in New York. Hey, Anita, go ahead.
Yes, hi. Good morning, gentlemen. Such a fascinating show. So, George, I need to alert you to an important email. The last part of the subject line says a new marketing idea. Those of us in the tri-state area can only tune in and sometimes not after 3:30. So, I'm missing.
Well, that's going to change in another month or so when baseball is over, so don't worry about
Yeah,
that.
but I'd like to hear the Saturday program. I heard Lisa once. If you could get a phone number like many shows have, and I would pay to subscribe, so that's something. Please send to my email, and I will try to follow up. But getting to Jonathan, I have a three-part question. The first part is a point of clarification since I tuned in so late. Spell Smita, and let me ask the full thing, and I'll listen over the air. The second part is I'd like to know if he hadn't talked about the genesis of his work. It's certainly intriguing, and I'll say that, and then I want to comment and hear his reflections. It seems to be corroborated by Webster Tarpley's work, who wrote 9/11 Synthetic Terror, and he said that on that day, 9/11, that the corporate debt went to zero. Now, contrary to that, though, it seems that using the Bible and the Hebrews, it seems to go against the grain in the respect that the settlement of Israel under Zionism was with European Jews of the Caspian Black Sea area who are also known as the Khazars, and so that's not the same thing as the original Hebrews. And if you understand, Jonathan, my question, my concern, I'll listen over the air for your response. And thank you, George.
Okay, you're welcome, Anita. Go ahead, John.
First of all, the Shemitah, the way it's spelled in the book, and you see, because it's Hebrew, so you have a few ways of putting it, transliterating it into English. But the way it's spelled is S-H-E-M, Shem, and then I-T-A-H, Shemitah. And then that's the second thing is that the genesis of it was really, it was when the economy collapsed. This was first begun in the Harbinger, where there's one chapter on it, but that speaks about what happened after 9/11, which is dramatic. But at that moment, I had a sense, but I didn't know for sure, that this thing was bigger and actually extended before that and has been affecting everything. So those revelations really came only in the last few months, and that's why this thing came out as just suddenly as it did. So as far as Israel, the Khazar kingdom, was a kind of an anomaly in history, but the Jewish people are still the Jewish people. But regardless, clearly the prophetic center point of history, no matter who you think anyone is Jerusalem, is Israel and Jerusalem, and that follows the exact pattern of the Shemitah as well.
Does the Shemitah tie into any of our presidential elections coming up in 2016, Jonathan?
Well, the interesting thing is that in all these mysteries, in the Harbinger of the Shemitah, there's always the leaders have been integral to it. They're the ones who are saying these, pronouncing judgments, saying these ancient things, and doing all these things. I believe it's part of the picture. And interesting when Obama was reelected, in his inaugural, he had a poet, give a kind of, a praise or something, and what he mentioned in that inaugural was the Harbinger. He spoke of the tower going up and a symbol of our resilience, which is it totally paraphrases Isaiah 9:10 and the Harbinger thing. So there is this thing going on. So not to say that it's going to determine who's going to tell us who's going to be elected, but the leaders are crucial in this mystery.
Okay, let's take some final calls here. Tom is in Greenfield, Indiana now. Tom, go ahead.
George, thank you very much. Long-time listener.
Thank you.
Jonathan, pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you.
My first trip in Jerusalem, I was unpacking my bags September the 22nd, 1987, and somebody said, "Here comes the opening music of the festival celebrating the rebirth of Babylon." Wow. 2 days later, I'm on the Temple Mount underneath the Dome of the Winds, and you know what the Dome of the Winds is all about. to the Golden Gate. So very serious individual. Just an article about the Call of the Temple, a book. I'm a big fan of BAR magazine, etc. But in 1956, a gentleman named David Noel Friedman did a book on the Babylonian Chronicles, British Museum. Ironically, they got the Babylonian tablets underneath the gates of Ishtar in 1907, 300 tablets, and conclusively, the city fell in August of 587. It's worth 13 pages. That's why I bring it to your attention. I probably got 50 books with the title Jerusalem in it. And that 86, 87 date, if you read all the books lately, about the last 50 years, that date switched. I didn't know why, and I was fortunate enough to find a book. Anyway, The Babylonian Chronicle by David Noel Friedman, 1956, published. I give you the name of the book because you're a serious student. The Biblical Archaeological Reader, published by Quadrangle Books in Chicago, 1961. Conclusive. It's a heck of a book, very studious, but those records really prove it. 587 was the year. Anyway, on the Shemitah, obviously it's 7 times 60, 360. We got all the proof that the period of time was 2,520 days for centuries. And of course, since we've gone to 365-day calendar, you have the VADAR added to months. My question is the compensation factor, because it's always been at 520 days. Flanders Peak, as you know, proved that the 25.20 is the sacred cubit, the secret to everything. I'm sure you're aware of what I'm talking about. That 2520 versus, for example, 2564 days between 2008 and 2015, and I think it's 2560 days rather than 2520. The compensation, do the rabbis keep a separate books on the 360, but they compensate the Shemitah to keep them accurate enough? But what happens to the dates? Because for 2,000 years was always matching up the 360-day year, which of course was 2,520 days, which is the secret to everything. So, important deal. Count them very carefully, very much aware of things, and I've got secrets revealed to me that I would prefer to maybe contact you personally some other time. It's magnificent thing. Seven goes in everything. I divided 6-digit calculated numbers on events going back to the 6th century to this century. That's 518 BC. It's funny. 69 years in our calendar, 2,501 days. It's 7 years in the old Bible, so 69 years of ours are there. So 518 matches up to, 1967. And I know all about the war, and I got 50 titles of Jerusalem, favorite books of Jerusalem, love the effort, love your work, and the thing about the dates.
All right, well, let's see if you want to react to that, Jonathan, before the clock gets us here.
Well, yeah, thank you. There is a link between the Hebrew calendar and the Babylonian calendar. Even the month of Tishri is linked to Tishru in the Babylonian. But what happens is, for those who don't know, it's basically a lunar calendar, but then it gets compensated according to the solar to keep it on track with a leap month. So it is very established when the Shemitahs will come, really from now to 1,000 years.
Let's go to Sam in Virginia Beach. He's been holding for a while. Sam, go ahead.
Yes, please. The mystery of the Shemitah started with Joseph or Yusuf, the prophet, the son of Jacob, the brother of the 12, when he's thrown in the well and then taken to Egypt, and he was imprisoned. And after that, the king had a dream of seven fatty cows. Yes?
Yes. There's a link there, and that is that the very first mentioning of the 7 year has to do with the economy. It has to do with famine and with abundance, and it's exactly that. You have 7 years of abundance, and you have 7 years of famine. And you had a warning to prepare. So yes, the pattern is there from ancient times, and it's still determining our lives.
The rise and fall of nations. Where does the United States fit in with the rise or the fall?
I believe that the warning here is that if we do not get it right, if we do not return, that we will watch the end of the American age as we know it. And the prosperity. Because one of the things about the Shemitah is saying that all the blessings we have are not from ourselves, and if we turn from our source, if we turn from God, they'll be removed. And we are watching a nation in free fall, and that is the warning. And I believe if we do not turn back, we're going to witness that change, and that's what the Shemitah brings.
Let's go to Carol in St. John's, Florida. Go ahead.
Hi there. My question, I have two questions, and you almost sort of talked about it just now. Why is all this Shemitah stuff seems to be related to the United States specifically? And then the second part is you talked about studying it back through like the beginning of World War I. Have you traced it back to events prior to that?
Yeah, it actually, when you look at the crashes and you say you go back even to the 19th century, it still follows the pattern. And as far as the America, this has affected the whole world. I mean, and the depression and the stock markets and the cataclysm affect the entire world. However, America's right now been in the center of history, so I think that's one reason. And the other reason is that America was actually founded after the pattern of Israel. The Puritans founded it to be in Israel, and they actually foretold that if we follow God, we'll be the most blessed nation. If we turn away from God, the judgments that came on Israel will come upon us. They said that. That's the Shemitah.
Well, a few more moments to go. 1 minute to go, Jonathan. The clock is ticking. September 25th of this year through September 13th of 2015. But can something happen economically, let's say, on the 25th of this year, this month?
It could. In the case of the Shemitah of 1937, the day the Shemitah began, the next day everything crashed. So it could. My sense is if something does, it's going to be more subtle than what happens at the end.
And this prediction of at the end, is that based on your interpretation or is there something else there?
It's based on two things. One is the actual history. It's continuous. And the second thing is that actually in the pattern from the Bible, it is the end that is the crescendo when you have the day of nullification.
All right, my friend. Be well, Jonathan. Let's keep in touch. Say hi to Joe Farah for me, will you?
Thanks so much, George. You too. Thanks so much.
All right, Jonathan Kahn. The name of the book, The Mystery of the Shemitah. Write down those dates. September 25th of this year through September 13th of 2015. There's that window. For Dan Galante, Tom Danheiser, Lisa Lyon, Lex Lonehood, Sean Ladesur, Stephanie Smith, Chris Boros, George Knapp, and Art Bell. I'm George Norrie, somewhere out there on Coast to Coast AM. We'll see you on our next edition. Until then, be safer.